members.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First up today, we have a request to the EMC to approve and proceed to the EMC, the committee approval, with the proposed amendments to 15A NCAC 02B 0202. Sue Homewood with the division is here to present that. Thank you, Sue.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am here to discuss implementation of Session Law 2023-63, clarify the definition of wetlands. This was a discussion item at the January meeting. So just briefly, Session Law 2023-63 required that the definition of wetlands be amended and that the commission shall adopt a rule to amend the wetlands definition consistent with the session law language. So this is what that looks like. The definition of wetlands is in the Administrative Code, Chapter 2B.0202. It's number 64. And the definition to comply with the session law, a sentence that is underlined was added, that wetlands classified as waters of the state are restricted to waters of the United States as defined by federal code. This changes the definition in compliance with the session law. As I'm sure you all know, to proceed with rules, we need to conduct a regulatory impact analysis. And as part of the package, we have a draft regulatory impact analysis that we will send to OSBM after this meeting concludes, if we get positive feedback. The regulatory impact analysis, because the proposed amendments in the rule were required by session law, and the session law is already in effect, and the division is already implementing the session law, the current status is the baseline, which is the session law is in effect. So because of that, there will be no change when we implement this rule. The proposed rule amendments do not cause any impacts to state or local governments and do not cause any substantial economic impact when compared with the baseline, which is the session law that's in effect already. This is our proposed timeline. I did present a timeline schedule in January, and there were some comments about whether we could speed that up. We did go back and look at our timeline, and we have found a little bit of ability to be back before the EMC with final rules in September instead of November. So this timeline proposes that if this rule amendment is approved today, we would submit the regulatory impact analysis to OSBM and then be back before the full EMC in May. If approved at that time, we would file with OAH to begin the public hearing process, a public notice process, public comment period. A public hearing, the earliest date we could have a public hearing is July 17th. That gives us just enough time to finish the comment period and propose the hearing officer's report and final adoption of rules to the EMC in September. If approved at that time, we would submit immediately to OAH. However, the session law dictated that this rule amendment be pending legislative review, which would be the next session in 2025. So we do not have an implementation date for the rule change, but we would complete our process by September. And with that, DWR requests that the Water Quality Committee approve to proceed to the Environmental Management Commission to request to proceed to public notice and hearing for the proposed amendment to Rule 15A NCAC 02B 0202 as directed by Session Law 2023-63. I am happy to answer any questions.
Any questions or comments from committee members?
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Baumgartner.
Yeah. A couple of questions, Ms. Homewood. So your regulatory, I'm fine with the wording. I think that wording of the rule change is fine. One question, a couple of questions I have on the regulatory impact analysis. Throughout the analysis, it states that there's no cost impact. Yet in local governments, it says the loss of wetlands may require local governments to address future flooding within the jurisdiction. And that to me looks like you're implying there's a cost impact. I'm assuming that you guys don't have any data yet on what the impact would be, correct?
No, we do not have data at this time. Much of the regulatory impact analysis, some of the scientific information was based off of a regulatory impact analysis that we did a couple of years ago for non-jurisdictional wetlands. So we took some of that background scientific information and put it in here. But we did make it clear that the session law is already in effect, so there would be no cost for this rule.
But it seems that regulatory impact analysis does imply there may be cost to local governments with this change. So what I'm saying is I think there needs to be a revision to the regulatory impact analysis to make it more consistent with how state governments and what's the one above, regulated community, that I think the statement that you have under local governments under loss of wetlands may require the future flooding, that I think some of that needs to be revised before it moves forward. So I'm saying there needs to be some revisions to regulatory impact analysis before this moves forward to make it more consistent with the, your summary that this does not cause additional cost, regulatory impact going forward.
Okay.
When you mean moving forward, Commissioner Baumgartner, are you saying that you want them to bring back information on that before we do something on this today as an action item, or would you prefer they just take care of that and get it to you or get it to the commission tomorrow?
I mean, I think we probably have more discussion, but I mean, I foresee a motion forthcoming to move forward and just have this regulatory impact analysis revised before it goes to full commission. But I'm open to hear other commissioners' ideas on that.
Okay.
A question.
Commissioner Ellison?
Is it possible to, because the language of the rule is adequate, is it possible to move the rule forward to the full EMC pending substantial revision to the RIA?
I think we might be saying the same thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure from a procedural standpoint, we can do that.
I think as a procedural standpoint, Commissioner Deerhake.
Thank you. I was going to add something to a request for the RIA, but to address your question, usually when there's something substantially being changed, we don't move that quickly.
Okay,
That's
thank you.
past history.
And I don't see this being substantial. I think it's just a statement in there that needs to be taken out and revised. And so, I mean, I don't see this as a substantial revision other than I don't agree with that statement.
Commissioner Ellison? Ellison, sorry.
Well, it's-
I think there are several misleading statements in here. You know, it says at one point, the definition removes protection on all wetlands that are not waters of the U.S. And I disagree with that. We have other regulatory structures in place that will continue to protect wetlands. The NPDES permitting, stormwater permitting, erosion sediment control permitting, those all do protect wetlands. So I think that statement is misleading. And as far as what Commissioner Baumgartner brought up and providing known flood capacity on the land, can you give me a specific example of a specific wetland or wetland area that provides known flood capacity on the land?
Not off the top of my head. As I said, some of this information was part of a regulatory impact analysis that we did a couple of years ago, and that had more documentation. I don't have that in front of me right now.
Okay, because it's a common misperception where it's generally thought that all wetlands provide substantial flood attenuation, and many do, but many do not. Particularly on small riparian wetlands in the Piedmont of North Carolina, they really don't do much, and there's substantial research to back that up. So in the other item, water treatment requirements, if sources are receiving more pollutants from runoff, again, you regulate those pollutants from runoff through other regulatory programs. So I think that's a little misleading. And as far as, again, back to Mr. Baumgartner's point about local flooding, local jurisdictions have substantial control over potential flooding from new projects. And so they don't approve projects unless the local floodplain manager approves it. And so I'm not sure how you're going to arrive at some sort of cost to local governments for flooding. Do you have any comments on where is the local flood management at the county or municipal level going to fail because some wetlands might lose state jurisdiction?
Well, to be clear, we did not evaluate cost in this because there was a baseline of this, the rule already is, or the session law is already implemented exactly as the rule is going to be. I understand what you're saying, and I have a note to remove that language in accordance with the request.
Okay, thank you. I think and then you've got a section on state government. And I think that there's a significant benefit to the regulated public and to taxpayers in general, because DWR staff, and we all hear how it's hard to find staff and you've got lots of vacancies and all that. Right now, or historically anyway, DWR staff accompany the Corps of Engineers on site visits when there's a permit application or wetland delineation needs agency verification. Are you still doing that?
Staff is continuing to work with the Army Corps of Engineers and consultants to conduct site visits when it's appropriate, based on what the project is and what permits they may be requesting in the future. That's
Okay, but if DWR would, basically the session law removes your jurisdiction over wetlands because it defines wetlands as what the Corps says wetlands are, and the Corps has primacy and the state has no legal role in regulating what the Corps regulates.
Yes, I'm sorry, I did not explain that well. We are not making any decisions about wetlands, where wetland boundaries are. We attend site visits because it is often also where we talk about application materials, what the site looks like. It facilitates the permitting process when it comes to that point. But we are attending site visits to help applicants ensure that when they get to the point of submitting an application to the Corps and DWR, if there are jurisdictional wetlands, that everything runs smoothly. We're not making any, unless there are buffer rules. Often we attend site visits because there might be other buffer regulations that are state implemented. But we are attending those site visits as invited as a participant in case there is a 404, 401 regulatory process to come later.
Okay. I think another benefit to both the state and the regulated public that ought to be pointed out, at the federal level, it's kind of been a game of ping pong with how wetlands get regulated and what is regulated as a wetland as new administrations come in and change rules, and then they go out and another administration comes in and changes the rules. They fluctuate a lot. And I think it's a benefit to the regulated public. There will no longer be a conflict or any sort of difference between what the state's going to regulate and what the Corps is going to regulate when it comes to wetlands and waters. And I think that's a big benefit to the people who do the wetland delineations and the permitting and the economic development people who are relying on some sort of certainty in the process. I think eliminating that uncertainty between the state and federal differences is a benefit that should be pointed out.
Commissioner Deerhake.
Let her finish making her note before I ask her question.
Thank you.
Speaking of benefits and impacts, it's, if I recall correctly, the language of the statute that says regulatory impact analyses or fiscal analyses shall be performed includes not only the impact to the regulated community and the state government, but also to the general public. And so I ask, it seems to me there should be some statement, some general assessment if you don't think you can find enough data, acknowledging that there are impacts and benefits to the public welfare and the environment with and without this new definition.
So my understanding from discussing with OSBM staff is this regulatory impact analysis is, we are required to identify the baseline, which is the session law that's in place right now, and what this rule change would affect. But because the rule change is identical to the session law, there is no analysis to really be completed. So to speak to the previous comments, it may be more appropriate to just say the baseline exists and the regulatory impact, this rule will not change that. My understanding in previous working on rules over the years is if we start to identify any costs, we will need to look at both sides of every coin. We cannot just point out the benefits. We have to point out, and we'll have to dig deeper. Staff will need time to do that, to get everything completed in order to be in front of the EMC in May. I don't know what OSBM's turnaround time is now, but to take this back and start looking at data would be a significant resource that we would need to do. And depending on if it needs to come back before the commission, that could change our schedule.
Okay, well, I will just say again, the broader purpose and scope of fiscal analyses is to look not only at the regulated community and state and government burden, but also the public welfare.
Yes, I think if we look at any costs or benefits, we'll have to look at all of them. Absolutely.
So to bring this full circle, as I understand it, Commissioner Baumgartner, you've just got a question of the sort of the narrative here or the wordage. Is it enough to stop it from being presented today? And Commissioner Ellison, with your comments, then trying to find that time period. With Director Rogers, do we move this maybe into our proposed or thought of April? Do we have enough to get this ironed out, or do we need to iron it out now?
I think what we're looking at is some substantive or some language change in the RIA. And as Sue noted, we look at it from the legislation that's in place now and the impact the rule has related to the current legislation, which is not of no type of impact because it's already being implemented and applied. So the rule does not have any fiscal impact in addition to what is already legislated. So my sense is we should be able to move. We'll make the clarifications and changes suggested to the substantive portion of the RIA, and then we should be able to move forward if that's the will of the committee.
Mr. Chairman, my comment too is to make everything consistent with the last statement in an RIA, that does not cause impacts to state and local governments and no substantial economic impact. In the local government section, it talks about a cost. So either there's a cost or not. I agree with the last statement of that RIA and just getting all that consistent throughout the document. So I see this as a very minor change that we can go ahead and move forward and into the discussion. I'm prepared to make a motion to move this forward.
Make sure we understand the moving forward, then getting those minor changes made to be brought back or to be acted on today.
If it's procedurally correct, I think the RIA could be changed and present it to the EMC at the next meeting.
Tomorrow.
No, next, it'd be next,
In May.
May, excuse me, May, yeah.
Does the department have any comments on that?
I think we're fine with that. Yes.
Okay. Then if you're ready to make a motion.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a question?
We're a timepiece, and I apologize for not bringing that up at the minutes, and I will allow that, but let me make something clear here. I apologize for the last meeting for allowing everybody to be discussing and bringing the meeting all the way to 5 o'clock, and especially not giving staff the appropriate time to present all they had worked for. We jumped over 3 or 4 slides, and it was 5 minutes for this staff member, and the presentations were short, and they worked hard to put those together. So I wanted to say that earlier, and I forgot to say that. I'm sorry. But today, we're going to committees, the committee members, we've got a time. I was aggressive with the first meeting with Director Rogers, putting all of this for a new committee, jumping out of the gate. I apologize for that. But we have tuned this in really nicely today to give the presentations, what they've worked for, the time that they've done it. So respectfully, as we go through this today, I will allow you to ask a question, Commissioner Smith, but we're going to stick to committee members today. Go ahead, please.
Well, that would certainly be a change in policy.
That's
So,
not, excuse me, Commissioner Smith, that's up to the chairman, that's prerogative of the chairman, so we'll.
that's fine.
Thank you.
So my question is actually a follow-up on Commissioner Ellison's comments, and he noted that other protections for wetlands, including NPDES and stormwater rules, but those rules use this same definition. To the extent this definition changes, it affects multiple rules across the NPDES stormwater, the permitting rules for non-discharge systems. We had the AG memo in September that listed quite a number of those rules. So I think it is fair to say that this language has a much broader impact, and it would not be correct to change the report to say that that it doesn't, that the impacts are limited and don't affect the NPDES and stormwater programs. And my understanding of the history of this legislation is the intent was to look at basically filling activities. That was the concern of developers, home builders. So it was focused initially on that particular type of impact, not on NPDES, not on stormwater, not on setbacks for sewer lines. But in fact, this definition applies to all those things. And so that was one comment, and I'll throw out one question, not necessarily for staff, but maybe for commission members to think about in the next couple of months, is whether it would be a good idea to further limit the proposed definition to say that for purposes of permitting deposition of fill material, wetlands classified as waters are limited to the federal wetlands, because that really is the impact that's been under discussion. And the language as proposed would have a much broader impact. But that's just throwing that out there for future discussion.
Specifically, the field material, I thought it was interesting, yes.
Could I respond quickly?
Commissioner
Two sentences.
Ellison.
First, the legislation is clear and does not mention fill material or other objectives, regardless of what the history and discussion in the legislature was. The wording of the statute does not give us the permission to insert limiting factors to the rule. Number two, if offline after the committee meeting, if you'd like to discuss how NPDES and stormwater regulations would not be effective in erosion and sediment control, would not be substantially affected by this, I'd be happy to explain that to you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellison. Commissioner Baumgartner, turn it back to you with your intentions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I make a motion to move forward the request or approval to proceed to the EMC in May with proposed amendment 15A NCAC 02B 0202 pursuant to SL 2023-63 with the requested changes to the RIA to be presented at the next commission meeting. That's a long motion. Apologize.
Motion's been made. Any second? Commissioner Yarborough, second. Any discussion? All those in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. All those opposed?
No.
It was not unanimous with one. Commissioner Derry.
And I'll say that my objection is because of the composition of the RIA.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Director Rogers.
Next, Karen Higgins, Section Chief for our planning group, will present and request approval to proceed to the EMC with the 2024 periodic review of rules, including O2B, O2H, O2T, and O2U. Karen?
All right, good afternoon. I will go through this pretty quickly. General Statute 150B 21.3A requires that the rules be reviewed every 10 years. There's 3 steps to this process. It starts with the agency, then it goes to the RRC, and then a legislative committee. So the agency review consists of placing rules into one of 2 categories, necessary and unnecessary. So at this stage, there's no revisions to the rule language itself. It's simply putting them into one of these 2 buckets. Once that initial decision is made, that goes out for public comment. We receive those public comments, prepare a report, and send that to the RRC. The RRC prepares the final determination report, and they submit that to the legislature. There's a number of things that are included in that report that goes to the legislature. And then the legislative committee makes the final determination of the report. If the committee doesn't meet within 60 days, then the RRC determinations become final. So there are a number of DWR rules that are within the purview of the Water Quality Committee. They are in 5 different subchapters. 4 of those are included today. The deadline for the RRC is October of 2024. Another subchapter, the O2G rules, are not until 2025. There are other rules within the Water Quality Committee's purview. This is just the DWR rules. So this is an example of the report, and I apologize that it's so small, but there are a number of things included in the report. It provides the subchapter, the rule section and citation, the rule name, the last agency action on the rule and the date of that action. And then there is the agency determination, again, whether it's necessary or unnecessary. Part of the RRC report is to include whether rules are necessary for implementing or conforming to federal regulations. So they ask for that information from the agency and then a citation to be included. So for O2B, this is surface water and wetland standards. All 114 rules are categorized as necessary. The O2U rule, which is for reclaimed water, are proposed 33 rules are categorized also as necessary. For O2H, these are procedures for permits. There's a number of different programs included in O2H. Currently, we have 109 rules listed as necessary and 3 rules listed as unnecessary. The 3 rules that are listed as unnecessary are based on session laws that were passed last year. The first 2 rules that you see are related to the Stormwater Fast Track Permitting Program. The authority for that fast track program was retracted by Session Law 2023-134. So those two rules are proposed to be listed as unnecessary. And then the last rule is part of the isolated wetland and water regulations. And as was discussed previously, the isolated wetlands are no longer part of the regulatory world. So this particular rule that focuses on soil series related to isolated wetlands, and that has been proposed to be listed as unnecessary. The O2T rules, there are 91 rules listed, proposed to be listed as necessary. Just a note, one of the sections in O2T, the soil remediation rules are under the, are implemented by the Division of Waste Management, and those will be heard by the Groundwater Committee later today. So what is being presented to you all within the Water Quality Committee is O2T except for Section 1500. Here is the proposed timeline. So we're asking for approval to proceed to the EMC, and Division of Waste Management will be requesting the Groundwater Committee approve to proceed to the EMC with that one section in O2T. We are proposing to go to the EMC tomorrow to request approval to go to notice. We file with OAH. There's a 60-day comment period. We will bring it back for EMC adoption of the report in September, get it filed with the RRC later that month, and then it'll go to the RRC in October. So with that, the request is to approve proceeding to the EMC with the rules review reports for 2B, 2H, 2T, excluding section 1500 and 2U. I'm happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions here? What's the pleasure of the committee with the request from the department? Director Rogers, do you have any comments?
No, sir.
Okay. Is motion to be on this?
Mr. Chairman, make a motion to request approval to proceed with the Environmental Management Commission with the 2024 periodic review for 15A, NCAC, O2B, O2H, O2T, and O2U.
Motion's on the floor. Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Ellison seconded. Any discussion?
Chairman, Reardon, I would have
Sure.
one question. I was under the impression there were three categories when it went for approval, you know, necessary, and then also necessary with substantial change or public comment. Is there now down to two categories, or in fact, are they three?
Yes, so the, excuse me, the first review did have three categories. There was a session law that changed it to two categories, so that necessary without substantive interest was removed.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Questions? All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Thank you, Karen. It's passed. That was unanimous. Thank you. Next item. Director Rogers.
The next item, the committee's heard a couple of times, but we're looking for the committee today to approve to proceed to the EMC for public notice and hearing on the proposed triennial review. And Chris Ventilaro will be providing this presentation. Chris?
All right, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Chris Ventilaro with the Division of Water Resources. And
Do you have the
to
presentation?
change this. Yeah,
There you go.
there we go. Okay, all right. So we're here, we did present a very similar presentation to the committee in January. So you'll see a lot of the same slides with the addition of a brief section on water quality standards background, since there were some questions over the last few meetings about kind of the role that EPA plays in the water quality standards and the role that the state plays in the water quality standards. So just added a few slides for that. But for today, we are coming to the committee with an action item request related to the 2023 through 2025 surface water training review amendments to select rules in 50A NCAC O2B 0200 rules. And as I mentioned, I'll provide a little bit of a water quality standards background as well. So to start off, just very basic, and this is really a very kind of tended to be very high level, kind of brief overview. I did put in some references to the Clean Water Act and EPA's Code of Regulations, Title 40, or their environmental regulations, so that folks can kind of know where the information is coming from in case you want to look a little bit more deeply. But in the interest of time, just trying to keep this very brief. But in a very basic sense, surface water quality standards are provisions of state and federal laws that serve to protect the surface waters as required by the Clean Water Act. The standards themselves describe the goals of surface waters by defining their designated uses, as well as establishing the criteria that are necessary to protect those uses. The standards provide the regulatory basis for the development of water quality-based effluent limits, and they also provide targets for restoration activities, such as the use of total maximum daily loads in cases where water quality standards are deemed to not be attaining the uses. So now for the legal basis of the water quality standards, the surface water standards are required per the Clean Water Act and EPA regulations. Clean Water Act can currently be found in Title 33 of the United States Code, Section 1251 and the following sections along with that. And the EPA regulations associated with the Clean Water Act can be found in Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So per these requirements, states must adopt, review, and update water quality standards at least on every 3 years, so a triennial basis. When states adopt standards, those standards have to be reviewed by EPA, and EPA can either approve them, they can disapprove them, and if necessary, they can also promulgate standards for states. The standards themselves must be based on sound scientific rationale, and this is something that causes some confusion from time to time because, per the Clean Water Act and EPA, it must be based on sound scientific rationale. So they can't really be modified to consider economic impacts or technical feasibility of meeting the standard. Now, this only applies for the development of the standard. These technical and economic considerations can be considered during the implementation of the standard. And some confusion does arise from time to time because of a different federal water quality program, the Safe Drinking Water Act program, does allow for modification for technical and economic feasibility. So there's often some confusion between the two programs. But the main point here is that for surface water standards, you cannot consider economic impacts when establishing the standard itself.
That is, pardon me on that, Chris, but that is quite interesting, the regulatory impact statement, and then taking that away from it in a sense for a narrative standard, that I can see where that would be confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely can be confusing. And we'll see, and as you dig into the rules as well, you'll see where the criteria, the requirements are, basically that you have to consider the science. And the implementation side is where there are opportunities through various means, such as like variances and we'll touch on this in a few slides also, but compliance schedules for permits, things like that come into play where we can kind of start to address. But I think the water quality standards themselves as a criteria are really meant, I think EPA sees them as being kind of like the baseline science that supports the designated use. And then from there, once you have that, you could start looking at other things.
Yeah, I don't mean to prolong it, but the physical analysis spreadsheet, is vague. And looking at that, do we need to draft a regulatory impact statement? From my understanding, you said we do not have to?
Well, there's different requirements. So the state does require that we do a regulatory impact analysis or fiscal analysis. So that has to be done. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned the fiscal note, because I meant to say at the beginning that I meant to remind the commission members that, along with this presentation, we do have a number of supporting documents that have also been attached for this item. In addition to the presentation, there is the preliminary fiscal screening analysis. Now, that is kind of a draft summary of what's being looked at for the regulatory impact analysis. So that's not the final version of the regulatory impact analysis. That's still going to be finalized and sent through OSBM according to the Administrative Procedures Act. So the information there is just kind of to provide a summary of where we are now, basically at trying to kind of, quantify or whatever, consider the potential impacts of standards changes. So that information can still change, and I'll reference that throughout the presentation a little bit as well.
Okay.
But there's also a few other attachments like the E. coli study, the actual rules that have the proposed amendments, toxicity summary sheets, as well as the 1,4-dioxane calculation sheet. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yes, sir.
So going on back to the standards, there are 3 core requirements of the water quality standards, and that includes the standards have to contain a designated use, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. They have to contain the water quality criteria that are necessary to protect those designated uses. Again, I'll mention more about that on the next slide. And they also require anti-degradation requirements. I'm not planning on talking about anti-deg in this presentation because that conversation can get kind of complicated and in the interest of time. But in a basic sense, those requirements are in there to protect waters that have existing water quality that is of a higher level than what's required by the standards. So those are the core requirements of the surface water standards. Now, EPA and 40 CFR also recommends that states adopt into their standards or in some manner general policies for the application and implementation of the water quality standards. And this is where some of that, as I mentioned before, some of that consideration for technology and cost and stuff like that comes in. So North Carolina does have information for these. We have water quality standards variances, the use of mixing zones, use of compliance schedules and permits, et cetera. For the designated uses really establish the goals, the objectives, and the desired conditions for how each water body is used. And it's important to note that that designated use applies whether or not the use is currently being attained. So the uses are described in the water body classifications. For North Carolina, that's in the O2B rules. And they may include things such as protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, recreation in and on the water, as well as protections for public drinking water supplies. The criteria themselves may be numeric or narrative and must meet the following requirements. Again, this is per 40 CFR. They must be based on sound scientific rationale. They must contain sufficient parameters or constituents to protect the designated use, and they must support the most sensitive designated use of the water body. And then along the bottom of the slide there, I just put in a few examples of numeric and narrative standards that appear in North Carolina's water quality standards rules. So there's an example of an aquatic life, a standard that's a numeric standard that's protective of aquatic life and the chronic beryllium. There's one that's representative of a water supply standard in the vinyl chloride. And then there's the narrative example of phenolic compounds, which really kind of applies more to the consumption of fish tissue, but from more of an aesthetic viewpoint where, you don't want the phenolics introducing bad taste into the flesh of the fish. That brings us to the triennial review. And the triennial review is really the rulemaking process, excuse me, that's used to adopt the standards into the rules. Now, states are obligated to review the water quality standards. And as part of that, they have to hold a public hearing at least every 3 years. They have to provide scientific justification for changes to the water quality standards. And they have to document reasons for not adopting existing EPA 304A criteria, otherwise referred to as National Recommended Water Quality Criteria. They also must submit the water quality standards to EPA for review within 30 days of the final state action. And this slide, I'm sure you've all seen this before. I pretty much include this on every triennial review presentation, but it just breaks that rulemaking, that triennial review process down into 3 steps. And they're just kind of like vague steps. But for the most part, the first part is the development of the standards, where staff review current standards, available EPA guidance and literature, and develop the rulemaking package, which then gets brought to the committees and the commission to weigh in on and approve and grant approval to proceed to the public notice portion. And then after public notice and public hearings, everything comes back to the commission to weigh in on whether to adopt the proposed changes. If that happens, the proposed changes or the adopted changes go to the RRC for approval, and then ultimately the North Carolina Attorney General signs off on any changes. Once the changes are signed off on, the whole package then goes to EPA for the federal approval process. And they conduct their Clean Water Act review, which includes an Endangered Species Act consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And then they basically notify the state of, the EPA notifies the state of their decision, whether they approve or disapprove of all or parts of the rule, and whether they intend to take any action on promulgations. So before I get into the actual action item part of the presentation, I just wanted to kind of stop for a second and see if anybody had any questions about this part.
Any questions, Chris? Commissioner Ellison?
So this is done every 3 years, right? And
That's the plan, yeah.
that's
Yeah,
kind of what I'm
yeah,
getting
it
at.
happened, yeah, sometimes it happens that things get a little bit delayed during the process, because obviously, the public weighs in and the, commission may need time to weigh on subjects, but
So what's our track record the past 3 or 4 triennial reviews as far as being on time?
so the 2019 was on time. That was really, 2018, 2019 was really focused on the first rules review. So that was done on time. The last triennial review, the 2020 through 2022, was done on time. There was a delay in the 2015 triennial review. That one was a bit of a delay with some complex subjects that did get delayed.
Okay.
Yep.
And I have, I'm not sure if it fits here in your presentation, but the sound scientific rationale requirement from EPA. And then in a lot of the supporting documents, EPA recommends and EPA suggests, but EPA doesn't mandate. And so I'm just wondering kind of how that fits in with your general approach. Do you typically go with what EPA recommends, or do you often, or how often do you have a sound scientific rationale to do something different from what EPA recommends?
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. So typically, and this is the case with most states, states often, again, don't have the resources to do kind of deep dives into scientific studies, conduct their own studies or do their own, scientific analysis to form their own standards and their own base of scientific justification. So most states will use EPA's national recommended criteria and potentially modify them slightly if there's a specific concern, like, for example, if there's a EPA recommended criteria that where you have, like for ammonia, for example, where freshwater mussels are really the key species, that's the most sensitive. There are states in the country that don't have freshwater mussels. So they may come in and kind of recalculate that number, and their argument being that, hey, our state doesn't have these really sensitive organisms. So we've adjusted this to better fit the species that we see in our state. EPA does encourage states to do their own work and to modify things. But again, oftentimes it comes down to resources. We don't have, and in this case, again, with most states, we don't have branches of we don't have research branches necessarily dedicated where we could say, hey, we need to research this. We try to do, what we can with the information that we have available to us. But in many cases, it's just not realistic or, feasible, or there's just no financial support or whatever to kind of do deep dive on every single criterion.
Okay. And just an example, so there's a cancer risk of 1 in 10,000 and then another threshold at 1 in a million. What might be the department's sound scientific rationale to pick one of those standards over the other?
Well, as far as the cancer risk goes, the commission back in 1989, when I think the most recent, the version of the rules, the basic structure as they appear now was kind of first introduced, they selected a cancer risk of 10 in a million, not more than one additional case of cancer in a million people. So that's been established in the O2B 0208
Okay.
rule since about 1989, I believe it is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right,
Any other
there's-
questions? Well, as you've noticed that you don't see the 1.4 dioxin on here.
It's coming. This was only the first part, so
You
yeah.
got it- You got into the, you got into the cancer piece and got into the fish and all that. So I was looking at the numbers and then you went into 10 to -6. So why is it, is used in everything in the triennial? Why is that? So as we, move forward, I just want to make sure we were on. track
Yeah, again, I mean, so
with the
EPA,
comments that were made.
when it comes to that cancer risk, EPA basically publishes all of their risk level, their cancer risk-based criteria at 1 in a million. So that kind of, their numbers are usually calculated at that risk. But more importantly is that we try to follow what's established in the rules already. So in O2B 0208, as we just kind of mentioned, that 10 to the -6 risk level has been in our rules as kind of the, how North Carolina views cancer risk in the rules. So that's what we work from. We try to follow that. We try to map in that rule.
Mr. Chairman,
Commissioner Jerry.
I would just simply add that's the standard practice federally and in the state, not only with water quality, but with groundwater quality and with air quality.
Okay, thank you. That's a good point.
Question?
Yes, sir. Commissioner Ellison.
Are there regulated compounds where that 10 to the -6, where the standard is below the detection limit?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So again, the standards themselves are based on the available toxicity information and the exposure factors that go into calculating, the health effects level or the criteria that will be protective of the uses. That's entirely separate from where the analytical capabilities are on the implementation side. So the standard, again, is serving as kind of that base protective level to support the use, not considering any other factors, just the available scientific information.
So how do you enforce something you cannot detect?
Well, in practical sense, what ends up happening is that the PQL on the implementation side, the PQL may actually become the practical level that's used. Like, for example, in a permit, if someone has a permit limit that's below the PQL will, as I understand it, I'm not an expert on the permitting side of things, but you would look to the PQL to say, okay, and a decision would have to be made as to whether there would be some kind of, violation of a permit level or something like that.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So it's more on the implementation side.
Yep.
Yeah.
Other questions? Like to move on?
Okay. All right. So this brings us to the actual action item request portion of the triennial. So again, department is requesting that the Water Quality Committee grant approval to proceed to the EMC with request for public notice and hearings for the proposed 2023 through 2025 surface water triennial review amendments to the rules shown in attachment B and listed here. And I'll read through the rules this time just so they're they're clear. The rules would be 15A NCAC, 02B, 0208, 0212, 0214, 0215, 0216, 0218, 0219, and 0226. As we've seen in the last presentation I did in January, for the 2023 through 2025 triennial, we focused on these topics. And those topics are the updating of some of the existing human health exposure factors in the O2B 0208 rule, updating some of the existing numeric criteria in the standards for human health, updating the primary recreation water or Class B water bacterial indicator organism from fecal coliform to E. coli, providing some clarifying language in the variance language in O2B 0226, making some technical corrections for clarity and updating, and also proposing the adoption of a fish consumption and water supply criteria in the standards for 1,4-dioxane. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go really deep into these since we just kind of saw this, but I'm happy to answer any questions. But for the human health exposure factors, as a reminder, in 2015, EPA updated national recommended water quality criteria, or the 304A criteria, for about 94 chemicals. As part of that review, they also updated the human health exposure factors that are used in the calculations of those criteria. We're proposing here to update the exposure factors that appear right now in the O2B 0208 rule. And you can see those here on this slide. You can see the current values versus the 2015 EPA values. So the proposal would be to update the exposure factors in O2B 0208 to the 2015 EPA exposure values shown below. So body weight would go from 70 to 80 kilograms. Drinking water intake rate would go from 2 liters per day to 2.4 liters per day. And fish consumption rate would go from 17.5 grams per day to 22 grams per day. Now, if you look at, there were some questions during the last meetings regarding, how updating these factors might affect values that we've calculated, derived numeric criteria that have been already calculated from the O2B 0208 rule. And if you take a look at the the RIA summary sheet, there is a summary, and I can mention that, go through that a little bit, just to give you kind of a sense of the universe of permit limits that are associated with some of these derived criteria or in-stream target values. So basically doing a scan of our database that holds the permitting information, it turns out that there were 106 permit limits associated with these kind of derived numeric criteria. Now, that 106 might sound like a lot, but that's very much an overestimate, as that 106 value incorporates not only the human health criteria, the fish consumption and water supply, that would ultimately change at some point in the future if these exposure factors were updated, but it also contains derived criteria for aquatic life. So there's some portion of that that's just aquatic life that wouldn't be affected by this change. And we haven't gotten to the point of parsing that out yet because it's a little bit more involved. We have to go to the individual permits to see exactly what they were based on. But for those 106 permit limits related to the various chemicals, this only impacts about 20 facilities. So it comes down to 14 industrial and commercial waste dischargers and 6 municipal wastewater dischargers. So there's a little bit more information about that on the screening sheet, and this is something that will also be discussed in the actual RAA once it's finalized.
So this is, do you understand 0208 then, this is a modification piece that
Yes.
you're talking about?
Yep.
And can you put a timeline on that?
Timeline.
On the studies, how and when will the narrative, the standard reports, you said that it would take time to do some of these things.
Oh, right. So in time, in the context of if these values were updated for the exposure factors and the facility had a permit limit for a chemical that would need to be recalculated, generally that would occur at the the permit renewal. So when that permit came up for renewal, the permit writers would still determine if there was a reasonable potential, if that was still needed. Then we'd go back and recalculate the number and really review the number and say, okay, has any of the information changed? The toxicity information, has any of that changed? And then recalculate it based on the updated exposure factors. So it really comes down to the individual permits for when that would happen for them. Right, that brings us to the updated human health criteria. Again, this is associated with the EPA's 2015 review of their human health criteria. Again, they reviewed 94 chemicals. And this was focused on the human health side of things. So for surface water, that relates to consumption of fish tissue, protection of water supplies for these particular chemicals. And when they updated it, they looked at updated toxicity information, inclusion of or updating relative source contributions, and updated exposure factors like we just discussed. The proposal for this triennial review is to focus on 14 of those updated EPA chemical criteria. And those 14 criteria correspond to 26 existing standards in the O2B rules. So 12 of those are associated with fish consumption in O2B 0208, and 14 are associated with water supply protections in the Class WS or water supply rules. I think this table should be familiar. We shared this last time. And this basically just shows what the 14 chemicals, and then it shows what the current fish consumption standard is, what the current water supply standard is, and then what the proposed values would be based on those EPA published criteria. They are color coded to show which proposed value would be lower than the existing standard, which is in blue, versus which would be higher than the existing standard, which would be in green. And I did want to take a second to mention here as well that if you refer to the regulatory impact analysis screening table, that does also provide a little bit of a breakdown for what we've seen so far in the workup of the regulatory impact analysis. So just a real quick review of that. Based on these 14 chemicals for both the water supply and fish consumption, that comes out to 28 individual permit limits. And that's associated with 9 facilities that have active limits. And of those 9 facilities, one facility would have all of their permit limits would become less stringent. And for 4 facilities, they would have all of their permit limits become more stringent. And then the remaining of the 9 facilities would be kind of somewhere in between, or both. So that information, again, is in the screening documents. And the proposed amendment for the updated human health criteria would be to update the 26 human health standards in the O2B, O208, O212, O214, O215, O216, and O218 rules to the 2015 EPA values that were showed in the previous slide, with the remainder of those 80 EPA 2015 updated criteria to be addressed in the next triennial review, which would be the 2026 through 2028 triennial review. Next up, we have E. coli. So the proposal here is to update the bacterial indicator organism that's used for kind of estimating the risk of gastrointestinal illness in our primary recreation or Class B waters. It's currently using the fecal coliform indicator group. And the proposal is to update that to instead use the E. coli indicator group. So I kind of talked through this more in the last presentation, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but the basic gist of it is that in 2012, EPA published updated bacterial indicator criteria. They provided a number of options that states could select from. And based on that option and based on the options provided and based on a study of fecal coliform and E. coli bacteria that the department conducted over the swimming season, we've used that information that basically comparing the fecal coliform standard to what the proposed E. coli standard would be. We kind of use that information to select as the basis for selecting E. coli over Enterococcus. and as the basis for choosing which option to proceed with for the proposed criteria. So that report basically showed that all of the Region 4 states are using E. coli, and that's pretty much true throughout the country. There was the option between E. coli and Enterococcus as the indicator. Everyone's using E. coli in the freshwater. We checked with laboratories and they seem to prefer that method as well. So that kind of formed the basis of going the E. coli route. That being said, the Enterococcus is used in the coastal waters, in our primary recreation waters in the coastal part of the state. So again, this is just addressing the freshwater stuff. As far as which illness level to select, which results in which numeric values actually end up in the standard, we use the information from that study to basically compare, if we took side-by-side samples in a stream, in ambient waters, what was the rate of exceedance of the fecal coliforms versus the rate of exceedance of the E. coli, proposed E. coli standard. And we found that using option 1 resulted in very little difference. Maybe a possible slight increase in the number of exceedances, but it was very, very minimal. And the same information was gathered for effluents. So there was a request, letters were sent to facilities and requested them to do effluent sampling, as well as some upstream and downstream sampling in their receiving waters, and basically showed the same information that, by going with option 1, it showed very little difference between using the fecal standard versus using the E. coli standard. So the proposed amendment here is to update the bacterial indicator standard for Class B primary recreation waters in the O2B 0219 rule to use E. coli as the bacterial indicator for EPA's 2012 recreational water quality criteria. And DWR recommends amending 15A NCAC 02B 0219 3B as follows. And I'll read through the language since it's kind of a mix of numeric and narrative. So part 3B says that Escherichia coli, or E. coli, shall not exceed a geometric mean of 126 per 100 mils, either as colony-forming units or most probable number, based on at least 5 samples taken over a 30-day period. Escherichia coli also shall not exceed 274 per 100 mils colony-forming units or most probable number in more than 20% of the samples examined during such period. And the numbers highlighted in yellow are just to show that those correspond with option 1 that EPA provided. And this language here basically is the same language that's currently in the rule for fecal coliforms, just with the substitution of the 2 numeric values highlighted in yellow.
So Chris, the 5 samples taken over a 30-day period is the same as it was?
Yes, yep. Yeah, we've tried to stay consistent, the 20% for the not to exceed number is the same as well. Tried to remain consistent with the practice that was already in place.
Quick question.
Question, Commissioner Ellison?
You said coastal waters, you use Enterococcus?
Yes.
Is that likely to change because of EPA recommendations? Could you just explain why that is instead of
sure.
E. coli?
Yeah, so it comes down to the methodology and the organisms that have a closer correlation with illness in the different types of water. So in salt water, the organism that had the closer tie to predicting illness rates was Enterococcus. E. coli wasn't as good based on the epidemiological studies. It didn't matter for freshwater so much, so there was an option. Our current standards for Class SB, which is our primary recreation and saltwater, they are already up to date. So unless EPA makes a change and recommends that states update their criteria in the future, there shouldn't change.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So that brings us to variances. So the updates to the language and variance is really just kind of a clarifying, including a clarifying statement so EPA recommended or requested that states include language in their variance language and their standards that clearly either references the requirements listed for variances in in 40 CFR, or at least directs to 40 CFR 131.14. And this is to really provide clarity for what the requirements for the establishment of variances are. So the proposed amendment is to clarify the requirements for variances in 15A NCAC 02B 0226 by including a reference to 40 CFR section 131.14 as requested by EPA. Similarly, technical corrections that appear in OTB 0208 and OTB 215 and 216. The changes are really made in 0208, they're really made to kind of update references that have become out of date, and also to provide some clarity with partly to update some of the language so that it is current, and also to provide clarity for how, certain selections are made in the information. For OTB 0215 and 0216, it's really reinstating a technical correction that the commission had previously approved in 2022 in the water supply rules. But in that case, those rules were actually objected to by the RRC based on the 1,4-dioxane topic. But these technical changes weren't a part of that. So we're just trying to get those back in there. And the technical corrections can be viewed in attachment B, which has all the rules. And lastly, that brings us to 1,4-dioxane. So again, EMC adopted fish consumption and water supply standards derived from the OTB 0208 rule on March 10th, 2022. This was objected to by the RRC in May. The department is proposing, again, to adopt values for 1,4-dioxane for fish consumption and water supply standards. This time, the values will be calculated or proposed here using the updated exposure factors that we talked about a few slides ago. And then there's one additional correction that I want to point out or change that I want to point out from the last time this was presented. Since that time, in communications with EPA, they've made us aware of a more current bioaccumulation factor. So that bioaccumulation factor was substituted in the equation, and you can see the change there in the proposed fish consumption standard. So the current fish consumption derived numeric criteria or stream target value is 80. When we presented this at the January meeting, the proposed fish consumption standard was set to be 70, but incorporating that bioaccumulation factor, it's now 40. This incorporation of this updated bioaccumulation factor did not alter the proposed water supply standard. It didn't play as much of a role in that part of the calculation. So the proposal here is to update the fish consumption and water supply standards for 1,4-dioxane to the values shown below and to codify it in the 15 NCAC 02B, 0208, 0212, 0214, 0215, 0216, and 0218 rules. That brings us to the rulemaking timeline. Again, we did a few information items on this topic in July, November of 2023, and January of this year. Today, we're here requesting approval to proceed to the EMC in May. And if that goes through and if the EMC approves us to go to notice, we'd be looking to file for register in May and go out to public comment period beginning around June 17th, with public hearings probably held. The earliest would be August 1st to meet Clean Water Act requirements. And the end of the public comment period being at the earliest August 16th, 2024, and with the rule coming back to EMC for adoption in January of 2025, roughly. So again, I'll repeat the action item request for today. The department is requesting approval, the water quality approved to proceed to the EMC with a request for public notice and hearings for the proposed 2023 through 2025 surface water triennial review amendments to the following rules as shown in attachment B and listed here. And that's all I have for today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
One question I had going back to 1.4,
Yes.
the cost report, is there any?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Is that somewhere in the 1.4?
Yes, it's on, it is in, and thank you for mentioning that. I meant to talk about that as well.
Thank you.
So it is in the preliminary screening analysis. Does have a bit of a breakdown of what information that we have on this. At the time that this was put together, there was one active permit limit for an NPDES municipal wastewater discharger, if I'm not mistaken. And in addition to that, there were 28 facilities that had active monitoring requirements. And of those 28, one of those was an industrial process and commercial wastewater discharger. 3 of them were municipal wastewater dischargers that with less than 1 million gallon per day discharge. 20 of them were municipal wastewater dischargers that were more like major facilities above 1 million gallons per day. There were also 3 stormwater dischargers and 1 groundwater remediation discharger.
Chris, is that report included in this?
Yeah, it should be on the first page.
Yeah, I just missed it. I'm sorry.
It's on, yeah, the first page shows O2B 0208. Yeah, it's in the table here. Yeah, I don't know if there's a way for me to pull up the attachments without throwing the whole system off. So I'm afraid to touch it, but it should be on this table on the first page. But if it's not, let me know and I'll make sure I'll update that.
Any, okay.
Yeah.
Any questions, thoughts or for Chris? Commissioner Ellison?
What is the one wastewater treatment plant that has,
That I don't know. I'm not sure if anybody else, staff knows offhand.
Julie can
Yeah.
address that.
Chris, the question was which wastewater treatment has a 1.0 limit?
Yeah, basically which permit limit, which is municipality.
Hi, I'm Julie Gribb, Deputy Director for the Regional Water Resources, and I believe at the time that was written, that was for the Ashboro wastewater treatment plant.
okay, and do you know off the top of your head what the limit was?
Off the top of my head, I do not. I
Okay.
think it was around 2021 or so. But since then, it's been, I believe it's under litigation at this time.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure we were talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
A couple other questions.
Yes, sir.
if I may.
Follow up. Yes, sir.
The new EPA bioaccumulation standard,
The factor, yeah.
did they just issue that from on high, or did they provide you with the rationale, the sound scientific rationale behind it?
It was published as part of a TSCA, which is the Toxic Substances Control Act risk assessment for 1,4-dioxane. TSCA kind of handles things more on the production side of things, but as part of their risk assessment for 1,4-dioxane, they provided all of this information in their report. And this was 2020, I think it was 2020 that the initial report came out with a draft kind of follow-up report that came out in 2022. So
So
that report has kind of the information on where that came from. I believe it was a modeled value from some studies that were done. Yeah, so that's all I know about it at this
So,
point. Yeah.
so a lot of the documents that the department posts for us, which are incredibly helpful, thank you.
Yep.
But I haven't seen that
That particular.
report.
I think the calculation sheet for 1,4-dioxane, which I think is attachment F, maybe, I believe it should cite that report.
The calculation.
The calculation sheet,
Okay.
but I will double, like I said, I can't pull it up. Yeah, I'm afraid to touch the computer, so. But it should be cited there. If it's not, definitely reach out and let me know and we'll make sure that it's there. That TSCA report, we can provide that report as well if you'd like to see it.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask, was it in the reference list in the January handout that you gave us?
It was not because we were not aware of that at the time. That came about after discussion with EPA following the January meeting.
Mhm.
Commissioner Ellison, were you finished? Question? Got something else?
Well, I do
Okay.
have a question. So have you read that report?
I've read some of it. Yeah, just that kind of that portion.
Okay, but because it's a new bioaccumulation standard, you said.
Bioaccumulation factor, correct.
Factor for the
Yeah.
equation, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
so a lot of the other documents, or not a lot, at least 2 that I know of, that have been supporting documents for previous meetings
Mhm.
state clearly that it does not, that 1,4-dioxane does not bioaccumulate.
Mhm.
It rapidly breaks down in your body and is passed out of your body. So what's new with EPA? I mean, can you just give us like any background on this?
Yeah, for sure. So the bioaccumulation factor, and again, this is modeled, EPA typically models these because field studies are very difficult to come by. They're very expensive and time consuming. So they're modeled based on the chemical characteristics of the particular chemical. And when we're talking about the bioaccumulation factor, we're really talking about it from the perspective of the chemical accumulating in aquatic organisms. So that the potential for it to accumulate in the aquatic organisms and then people to be exposed to those higher concentrations in the organism. So that's more of the context of how the bioaccumulation factor is developed, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, but other references state that the primary pathway is inhalation.
Mhm.
And if you eat a fish that has too much 1,4-dioxane in it, it may be bioaccumulated in the fish, but how do you, if the threat to humans is inhalation, how are they making that connection, or is it just more assumptions?
Yeah, so they're basically different exposure. So, again, it kind of, some of the information comes from different sources looking at different exposure types. So for your typical person, day to day, their primary exposure may be based on inhalation of 1,4-dioxane, especially if in working environments. But when you're looking specifically, what these surface water standards are doing is that they're looking at this specific exposure route of consuming fish that people have caught from surface waters. So this standard is really being based on that exposure. And if you're consuming fish, then you're being exposed to that. So the understanding of the degree to which that chemical is potentially accumulating in that fish tissue kind of dictates what the person's exposure to that chemical is going to be, independent of inhalation exposure. So it's looking specifically at this exposure route. It's not looking at the universe of exposure routes. It's
Understood.
looking, yeah,
But
specifically.
it sounds like if have they changed whether or not it bioaccumulates in humans and rapidly breaks down and passes out of the human system? Or because it would seem to me that no matter what the pathway is, if it does not bioaccumulate in humans and rapidly breaks down in humans, then there's a disconnect in my head. And I'm hoping
Sure,
you can
sure.
help me out.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this goes back to the way that the water quality standards are kind of designed to look at human health protections. They're designed to look at lifetime exposure. So there's certain assumptions based on the way that the methods that EPA uses, EPA methods for doing this. There's assumptions made that you're getting a lifetime of exposure as you're eating fish, and especially with carcinogens, any exposure has the potential to result in carcinogenic effect. So as you're exposed to this, you're trying to keep a level that would maintain it below that risk level of 1 in a million, if that makes sense. I'm not sure. It's kind of hard to summarize. Yeah.
And I understand what you said, but I'm still losing it on if it doesn't bioaccumulate, what's the lifetime exposure? Why does that matter if it does not bioaccumulate?
Right. So again, it's discussing bioaccumulation from perspective of it bioaccumulating in the fish tissue that people are then eating. So we're not talking about the metabolism, the potential for metabolism in human. It's every time you eat a fish, if it has a certain level of accumulation, you're being exposed at that level. And if this cancer standard is set up to limit your cancer risk to 1 in a million, a risk level of 1 in a million over the course of your lifetime, every time you eat that fish that has levels, there's potential there that you're going above that 1 in a million risk level. So it's kind of a different focus, if that makes sense.
That's very helpful. Do we have any fish tissue analyses that support this assumed modeled estimated bioaccumulation?
That's a good question. And I don't know the specific North Carolina studies. Yeah, I don't know I'm not aware off the top of my head if anyone has done bioaccumulation factor studies of 1,4-dioxane in fish tissue in North Carolina.
It appears that the primary risks would be in the Cape Fear River system from what I've seen. And, you can go catch some fish and then send them to the lab and see what's there.
That's true. However, that's a lot more complicated than it sounds in practice. Again, it comes down to, so yeah, we've done studies for different chemicals and they're very intensive efforts to.
I understand.
Yeah.
I've participated in studies
so-
like that.
yeah, for sure.
So I know
Yeah.
what happens and how it's done. I know it's
Yeah.
time consuming and expensive and all that, but so potentially would be a regulation based on a model that I understand it's intended to be highly protective of public health and all that. I get it. And so, okay.
Mr. Chairman, can some of the other
Yes,
members
second.
ask some
Okay.
questions and make some
Wait
observations?
just a second.
I'm done. He answered my questions. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Commissioner Derrick,
Let me ask if there's anybody else that wants to ask questions. I've already asked a few.
committee members, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Do any other questions for committee members? I mean,
I do
Got-
have questions, but I
Sure,
want.
go ahead,
to give-
please.
Okay. And an observation too. The Integrated Risk Information System, that is a program that EPA has administered for years, has two basic categories: reference concentration and reference doses. Reference concentrations are for air inhalation rates and human exposure to contaminants through air. Reference concentrations are for ingestion. This particular setting, what we're discussing today, is for the ingestion. Those are, I assume, independent panels of reviewers, but they comb through all of the peer-reviewed literature and determine what is a defensible concentrations of ingestion rates that cause certain numerically based health effects standards numbers. And those numbers are published after extensive peer review and research studies to look at the arrived at reference dose, which we're talking about here. And as Mr. Ventilaro has explained so well, it's the bioaccumulation in the fish, not in the human. So it's the amount that the human is ingesting at a certain point in time when they consume fish at a certain rate. As for the consideration of the bioaccumulation rate in fish regionally, I assume that the Integrated Risk Information System panels also take that in consideration in setting a nationwide standard. They look at the scope of the fish presence, the accumulation rates of different species, and they make that judgment call on a national basis, knowing that things are going to vary across the country. So it's not the bioaccumulation in humans, it's the ingestion rate of a certain concentration of the chemical. We have relied on the Integrated Risk Information System database for years with our groundwater standards, our water quality standards, and our air quality standards. They're a respected scientific body that I think deserves our respect here with this consideration too. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Derrick. Commissioner Yarber?
Just a question or two, I guess, is how many you actually had wastewater treatments that's going to be, how many across the state would be impacted by this if we were to enact this?
For the 1,4-dioxane? Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure if there's more recent information. But as far as I know, there's, right now there's the 28 that have monitoring requirements.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah.
Would this be additional to any wastewater treatment plant?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if anybody wants to answer.
The question was how many facilities would be affected by 1,4-dioxane?
Or possibly could be.
Or probably. The main ones are about 5 to 6 that would get a limit. 5 to 6 major POTWs.
Now, so you're sampling now all wastewater treatment plants with 1,4-dioxane?
We sampled and we have them doing their own samples and for the last, since about 2015. And we pretty much narrowed it down that there's 5 or 6 facilities that have an issue with 1,4-dioxane in the upper part of the Cape Fear.
Right. We do have a letter from 3 of those towns, our cities, obviously, and they have quite a range of expense just for what they estimate,
They do. I've been working with them since
Yeah.
2015.
from 10 million to 1.2 billion. That's quite a range, but do you dispute any of this letter from the Greens?
I'm afraid I don't know it by heart and didn't have time to dispute each point. I wouldn't be able to do that here. But it's, I will say that we've been working with them and they've had a tremendous success story with Greensboro. At one time, they never thought they could get it to the point to where they have gotten it below 10 consistently, was at one point above 800. And working with their SIUs, doing the collection system surveys, they now have it down below 10 consistently, that's a great success story. And it shows it can be done.
Yeah, by working upstream and finding where the source is, I assume.
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay. Do you have any, I know this is going to be from our last meeting, it was kind of painful to ask about fiscal. Is there anything associated with, there's going to be any kind of cost estimate if this is enacted? Well, is there any way to do that? That's the question we need to ask.
Well, I believe the collaboratory is working on that right now. It was the legislation that requested them for them to do 1,4-dioxane assessment. And so we should have that data pretty soon. I guess it gets touchy as to whether you really have to install treatment at the POTW versus going and working with your SIUs to do the work.
Maybe if you said, did you already say what SIU and POTW?
Okay, SIU, significant industrial user who discharges to the publicly owned treatment works. Thank you.
Many times that's a lot more practical too. From a historical perspective, I guess, I can still remember 0200 laws with dairies. If we were to use the same thing, we require municipalities to treat, then dairies could have asked the same thing.
Yes, absolutely.
So the precedent is, that's just an anecdote. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other comments, concerns, questions?
I guess to feed off of Commissioner Yarborough's questioning, I mean, what we've been provided as far as physical analysis is this spreadsheet. And for 1,4-dioxane, it says unlikely to result in significant cost benefits compared to baseline. We have, I mean, the processes we've been through the last few months with 1,4-dioxane has pointed out there are significant costs, or there possibly could be costs. Yet the spreadsheet that we get is honestly less than the physical analysis we've had in the past. And it says there's no significant net cost or benefit.
You want to go ahead and take that? Go ahead.
Yeah, so the regulatory impact analysis, again, has to be based on the baseline. And the baseline, I think, has been determined as being the current application of the derived numeric criteria for 1,4-dioxane that's already kind of being used for monitoring and permitting. So based on the comparison to that baseline, that doesn't kind of change. The requirement is still there. So, and I'm not sure if anybody else has any further.
But isn't that, and I'm sorry if I get the terminology.
Follow up?
Yes, follow up. Yes, sir. Sorry. Isn't that based upon the department's decision to move forward with that with permit requirements, not necessarily going through a rule change to make that happen? I mean, you basically have made a baseline yourself and saying, okay, well now there's no significant change in the baseline, but you established a baseline without public comment and discussion.
We believe we have the authority to make narrative standards, so that's a point of contention, I understand, but we believe we do.
Mr. Chairman,
Commissioner Drake,
I'm prepared to make a motion if you're ready.
if there are no other questions.
Mr. Chairman,
Commissioner-
I apologize. I had to step out of the room for just a minute, but I know we're in receipt of this letter from 3 municipalities, from Asheboro, Greensboro, and Reedsville. And they call into question pretty clearly here the ability of DEQ as it would relate to the appropriate classification of this carcinogenic, non-carcinogenic status here. And they call into question the process being used. Can we discuss that here? Is that out of bounds? Or
Yes, sir. As committee, we discussed, if the letter is of concern because of the 1.4. Yes, sir.
may I ask the question, then, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Can we get an explanation? Is these 3 cities that wrote this letter to us that we're all in receipt of, are they in error with the language they provided us, which calls into question actually how these substance standards are for the ITV and such as that is being identified? Can you help us a little bit on the second page of this letter here?
Well, basically, I was just going to say I'm potentially involved in the litigation as a witness. So I'm not sure it's appropriate for me to kind of comment on the topics in that letter at this point, being that I might be involved in the litigation. So I'd have to kind of step aside for that.
Mr. Chairman, follow up?
Yes, sir.
Is there someone else then outside of the litigation that can help us understand this?
Yeah.
Okay, we got a crowd.
Yeah.
All right, I'll start. As part of one of 3 legislative studies that are related to the surface water standards, everything that Chris talked about, there are 3 legislative studies that are underway. One of them, the Environmental Management Commission is leading, and that is looking at the narrative standards, the history of that, how those standards have been applied in setting water quality standards. So I believe today Karen is going to go over the foundation of the 0208 rules. And that will answer your question, is whether or not the department has the authority to use 0208 derived standards into permitting actions. What we are doing here is translating that narrative translation mechanisms into developing a numeric standard for transparency purposes. You may recall that when the EMC adopted that numeric standard, the reasoning was that the narrative standard gave us the authority to regulate 1,4-dioxane when it is a toxic substance of toxic impact in our water systems. And therefore, the department issued a permit for Greensboro several years ago under that 0208 formula. The commission, there was a challenge. The commission went through settlement and ended up with a 3-year phased out schedule for complying with that 0208 derived 1,4-dioxane surface water quality standard. What we're trying to do here is create more transparency, because out of that process, it was revealed that there's no way for the permittees to understand what their obligations or requirements are, because that translation mechanism in 0208 is not transparent. Normally, the department or the division eventually translates that 0208 and puts it into a numeric value that shows up as a number in the rules. And so that is what the department did about 1.5 years ago. And that is what ended up being stuck at RRC. And that was what was talked about. And when Karen goes through the history of 0208, the foundation under the Clean Water Act required each state to provide a mechanism for how we would regulate toxic substances with toxic effects in our water systems. And so that is really where the starting point is. There's argument whether that is true, but that is really what the starting point is. I will go on and add two more components that I think Chris in the previous presentation explained, is that these health-based standards are strictly based on toxic effects of the water, in the water, drinking water, in the surface water discharges that are eventually used for its intended purposes. And so the health-based standards are what the 0208 strictly allows the EMC, which is required in the Clean Water Act for the state to propose their approach that got adopted by EMC and eventually ended up in the Code of Federal Register. And so I will just summarize. I hope this has been helpful. The standard itself is health-based. So if you look at that formula 0208 that Chris mentioned, there is the reference dose and or a cancer slope factor. There's the bioaccumulation factor, and there are these human health exposure factors that Chris mentioned, which is the weight of a person drinking this water for 70 years of a lifetime, the ingestion rate of the water, and the fish consumption rate. So everything we talked about, not including the cost, not including technology feasibility, it is really just looking at the toxic effects of a toxic substance that requires us to determine the concentration that is safe for human consumption of that water over a lifetime. How the state ends up using that concentration in its regulatory programs is where our regulatory permitting process and our implementation of those programs come into effect. And as Chris and others mentioned, there are flexibilities and there are ways to address that particular health-based standard. And I'll just summarize that Karen will go over the narrative part. There's a separate study with the collaboratory where we're providing guidance as they request that looks at the cost of complying for this about half a dozen or so permittees. We have 53 or so direct industrial dischargers. We have, POTWs, which are pretreatment operators. And within those, there are SIUs, significant industrial users. So we do believe that the source reduction is the primary mechanisms for achieving compliance. And we have track record that it is possible and is cost effective. And then third study that we're looking at, which the department is leading, is what are the human health assessment of 1,4-dioxane in drinking water. And we will be coming back to you all with a report on that. It is due to the legislature in May.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ellison, he has one question.
Maybe two.
Maybe two.
For who? The department. The one lady said that there's currently one permit with a 1,4-dioxane threshold, right, with requirement. And I'm getting the impression that from a fiscal analysis standpoint, because there's one permit with a requirement, then there's no change. Then that is the status quo and applying the rule to everybody. I think I'm misunderstanding, so I'm trying to get some clarification on that. You said you had the authority and you've exercised the authority for one treatment plant, right?
You could answer that.
So I don't want to get all this confused with how we've permitted and what has done, because there's no relationship. The decision to say that there's no cost is that the baseline was that we already had a narrative standard. And we had the numbers 80 and 0.35, and those were in the state books. So as a result, they're simply saying if we adopt it as a numeric standard, there's no change.
Okay. So the numeric standard is equal to the number in the narrative standard.
That's correct.
But that has never been through rulemaking, but you have the
It has been
authority.
ruled through the rulemaking in the 2B standards. In other words, we adopted the equation that Chris just showed you.
Okay.
We have those equations, we have those procedures, we have that process. And the narrative standard is created from that process. And that's the baseline.
Okay, and these are all EPA equations, EPA bioaccumulation factors and all that?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
And, okay, I'm good.
Okay.
I would comment that the sound scientific rationale requirement is a challenge, I think. We're relying on all kinds of EPA numbers, and this is the same EPA that changed the nationwide requirements for lead in drinking water based solely on the research of Dr. Herbert Needleman, whose research was totally panned because it turned out he falsified all his data. This is the same EPA that fed people diesel fumes right up the road in RTP. And there is a lot, there recently published reports of top-tier peer-reviewed journals that find almost 50% of those studies cannot be replicated and/or the data were bogus. So I think that as far as 1,4-dioxane goes, I think we need to do a lot more homework before we put these standards into a rule. And they may all be right, and we may have done everything right, but I think the costs are massive, no matter how you look at it, for the treatment plants that have sent this letter to the commission. And I think we owe it to them and the rest of the state to make sure we get this rule right, and that if those massive costs are in fact going to be imposed on them, that we better have a good reason for it.
Any other questions? Thank you, Commissioner
Mr.
Ellison.
Chairman,
Commissioner Derrick.
I will just point out, as our staff has so well, that we have had an extremely successful story with the city of Greensboro. And it was not the massive cost. There was always a concern about having to look at serious technology changes. And those costs were comparably negligible compared to technology installation, which they did not have to do. It went through careful analysis of what was coming in from upstream, sampling and monitoring. They did invest in sampling and monitoring, and we appreciate and respect that investment. But as Chair Solomon, who was participated in some of the early evaluation of what's going on that's causing these surges in stream concentrations to the treatment plant, can tell you it was careful source analysis that looked at and identified what the problem was upstream. That is always the first step that these plants should be going through as they're having this delegated authority to manage significant industrial users. So this is not an automatic application of or a mandate that's saying you shall install this technology. We can't presume that in every case here. I do think that there are a lot of solutions that can be taken care of by working carefully with the local community of industrial dischargers to those treatment plants. But I'll also say that there have been significant costs and disruptions with the people downstream of those effluent discharge points. And these are not these are not standards on the effluent discharge. This is the in-stream value. So after it's still traveled downstream and been considerably diluted, there are communities that have had to switch to drinking water from gallon jugs and other non-traditional supplies because of the disruption to their water quality and their intake systems, the quality of the water going in their intake. So that's something to consider of this. I would also say you just can't make a general statement about the EPA has done this, the EPA has done that. We have seen over the years with all of our standards development, all of our regulatory development, that the values that come in for groundwater decision-making, air quality, and water quality decision-making come in from independent panels that are assembled of respected scientists and go through the scientific literature, peer-reviewed literature, to make recommendations to EPA. And those are the numbers that EPA arrives at. And those staff are also trained and great deal of expertise, and they make those decisions based on the weight of evidence that they see coming from the scientific peer-reviewed literature. So I want to just make that point. And I will say once again, Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to make a motion when you're ready.
Yes, ma'am. I'll take note of that, Commissioner Deering. Commissioner Reardon?
Yes,
Other
and
questions?
maybe I'm missing something. I'm hearing the success story about Greensboro, and I'm thankful for that. Maybe they identified a point source. But they must still have concerns to have signed a letter to us on March the 8th. And I'm just wondering if we properly addressed that. Just a question.
May I?
Yes, ma'am.
The rationale that they're using there, I think, is all based on the categorization of carcinogens in this particular letter. That was not necessarily something I've heard in the past. It was more technology focused. This is a new topic that they've introduced, but we've had many groundwater and air quality and water quality standards adopted in the past based on a likely human carcinogen versus a human carcinogen. We have had to use our best scientific judgment over the years, our best policy judgment on how to handle various carcinogens. And our goal at this commission is to protect human health and welfare. We certainly understand that there are impacts to the handlers of these chemicals, and we work with them through our permitting programs to find reasonable implementation of these standards that can be affordable over time and still benefit the public.
Thank you, Commissioner Deering. When the EMC chairman raises his hand ex officio in all committees, when he raises his hand supposed to speak, I'm going to give you
And I
the
wasn't going
seat.
to say anything, but
Will you
I
raise
let
your?
two things go, but then my name got brought up, so I'll. And I do think
Chairman
Commissioner
Solomon.
Deering's right, but I don't think the primary reduction of the source is the issue. We have proven statistically, I'm a reliability engineer, we can get that down, statistical process control. The best we've done is we've got Greensboro and Asheboro maybe down to 10 or 9. The question here is, how do we get them down to 0.33? And can we even measure it? See, the debate's not whether most of this will happen. Yeah, we know from hazardous waste cleanup, we can take it from 100 and knock it down to 10. But we're not talking about stopping at 10. We're talking about going below 1. And so I think that's the rub. And when you look at these communities or ask about the cost, to Commissioner Reardon's point, is they acknowledge they can get it down to 10. We're going to tell them to get to 0.33. And they have concern about that cost. And I think that's what that treatability study is all about, that the collaboratory may be doing. How do we get it down to some level? I hope Richard says no, but I hope they're looking at how to get it down to the regulatory level, not just reduce, because it's not acceptable if we can only get it to 10 and then we have to reduce all the industrial users, if we have to run off all of industry to get it to 0.33. We don't want that. We want a treatment solution that gets us that gap.
And again, I think that's the development of the standard and the difference between permitting and the standard itself.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. But I just want to caution everybody, because I did hear earlier, and that's my concern about this automatic translation. I know we've had it since 1989, but I've heard the department say twice today, and they've said it past, it's a success story. It's not a success story. If you've been enforcing at 0.35, not 0.35, and you can't get it down to 10, it's a success story and you've had a monitoring program, but it's not a success story and you've been able to achieve the exact goal. So we can talk about how you permit these things and all that, and we may need to. But I want to make sure that whatever we come up with here, it's to an achievable level that we can all agree on. Because what we have to do is explain to the public what you guys have been talking about for 2 hours. And I don't know that we've got it down to a place we can explain it yet.
Commissioner Twitty.
I'm just going to ask for a clarification in something I thought I understood earlier today, and now I'm starting to question it. So the thing before us right now is to set a standard, and I think Mr. Ventilero did a good job this morning explaining something I hadn't realized, that setting a standard and then how you do implementation are two different things. And he made the nice analogy that if the standard is set at 0.3, 0.2, and the detection limit is 1, then the implementation and permits usually get set at 1 because that's where the detection limit is. So I feel like we're conflating two different things here. Of setting a standard, which should be set based off the best available science. I also don't think the state should redo every study that EPA does. But set that standard based on that science, and then how you implement that. I think what the department's trying to say, and I guess you could be pessimistic, but they're trying to say that they work with these folks to try to figure out, okay, how do we get as close to that standard as practical? So did I understand that correctly?
Got it.
Okay.
Yeah, there's some.
If I might add to that, that's exactly correct. When you go to do the permit, that is the time we can set a reasonable schedule and milestones for them to achieve. That is the time they can seek a variance if it's cost prohibitive. All that can be worked out in a permit. And we are not asking, most of all these 5 permits we're talking about, we are not asking them to get down to below 1. We are asking them, we're setting it based on the downstream water supplies. And I presented to this group on how we would use the water supply boundary as the marker to develop a limit, and Greensboro getting below 10 would be sufficient. Okay. There's only one facility that has a low number, not below detection, but a low number, and that's because they discharge directly to a drinking water reservoir. But we would have to work with them. There's no question.
Any others? Okay, so before I will entertain a motion that she's ready to, Commissioner Deerhake is ready to make, I'd like to make some clarity that November this was discussed. And in January, as chair, we took it off because of the separation between the 1.4 dioxin and the triennial and the dates that were to get this out of committee. And at that time, I felt like all the commissioners were not fully up to speed, but certainly after our January meeting, I think we are. And today, as you've seen, we've included it and not separated it. And also, I've talked with the director to see, Director Rogers, to see if we need a waiver to be expedited and move a committee meeting into next month and have the staff ready to put together any ask that the committee members have that we will need to move forward and get this cleared up. But I certainly would like to see it get out of committee and get it to the full EMC. And I think the EMC commissioners, as we see today, that here at the Horseshoe with us, that there's enough of what we've heard and discussed that the EMC is ready to hear it. But I, as your chair, want to make sure each committee member has total knowledge and are clear moving forward to the EMC. I do not want them to give it back to us. So would that just be clear that we're not dragging this out, and we want to comply. The department's done a great job putting it together. But if committee members are unsure and you think we need to have a waiver and have a meeting in April, we'll certainly put some dates together with some ask from committee members if we need to. So with that said, Commissioner Deerhake, you certainly have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am.
I move approval to proceed to the EMC with a request for public notice and hearings for the proposed 2023 to 2025 surface water triennial review amendments to the following rules as shown in Attachment B. 15A NCAC 02B.0208, comma, .0212, comma, .0214, comma, .0215, comma, .0216, comma, .0218, comma, .0219, comma, and .0226.
The motion's on the floor. Is there a second? Commissioner Twitty. Motion's been seconded. Discussion. Commissioner Ellison.
I'd like to offer an amendment that this move forward with this 1,4-dioxane being severed the rest of the triennial review to proceed on its own pathway. There are other issues that we're compelled to address by the legislature, collaborative, looking at the costs, legal issues with lawsuits that are in process. I think we need to find out a little bit more of what we hear from Greensboro, Reedsville, and Asheboro. And I think that the triennial review can move ahead. And I'd suggest we pull 1,4-dioxane and investigate that further.
Okay, there's an amendment on the floor of that, and is there, you want to make that a form of an amendment? You want to move on your amendment to that?
Yeah, make a motion that an amendment be added for what I just said a minute ago.
Okay, we will take that amendment.
It sounds more like a substitute motion to me.
It could be.
We'll ask our counsel, well, how does it qualify?
I don't, so normally you would vote on the main motion and then the amendment, which wouldn't work in this case because one kind of replaces the other. Either dioxane is in or dioxane is out. So I think it is probably a substitute motion for Commissioner Deerhake's motion.
Okay, the substitute motion has been made to take out the 1.4 dioxane from this motion. That's a substitute motion. Is there a second?
Second.
This has been seconded by Commissioner Baumgartner.
Mr. Chairman, do we need to be specific within that list of section numbers? How does it impact the list of section numbers in the motion?
Okay, it's been
Can I get a
seconded,
point
the
of order?
substitute motion, but we can, any discussion?
Yes, really a point of order. This is probably not the time to break it apart until you've got it ready, because we can't, if you get 1,4-dioxane ready next time or in May, then you've got two separate rules that are going to be heard at the same time. We probably need to keep it, if we think we can get 1,4-dioxane resolved in April or May when it comes to the full EMC, with the whole triennial review, we need to keep them together through this committee probably, and we can make some decisions later. The other thing I point to, and it's your report, but 208, the narrative standard that Karen's about to present on that we haven't heard, and you haven't finalized the report yet, or the committee hasn't. We don't even have it yet, but 208 is common to triennial review and to the 1,4-dioxane discussion. So what you do for one, you got to do the other, and we don't have the narrative standard report back yet. And so they both impact each one. So it feels like we need to keep them together if we think 1,4-dioxane can be clarified in the next couple meetings. It can always go to public later as two motions or two substitutes, but we don't want them on separate paths, I don't think. I don't think legally we could talk about that. It will have hard having public hearings at the same time on the same rule.
Mr. Chairman?
Wait a second. Your question for legal?
Well, in terms of the rule process, I mean, you will have opportunity later to change the rules or review the rules. And my understanding of this action item is just to send them out to public notice and hearing, where you will get more input back from the community that may impact how the rules are anyway. So these are not necessarily final rules. So you would have more opportunity to address those later. And so it would make more sense at this point probably to keep them on the same pathway.
Commissioner Deerhake?
Well, rather than making a decision about holding off on all the rules, is there some way that we could just temporarily offer him the discussion about the dioxane, but keep the remainder of it on course for May, and then make a decision about whether to bring dioxane back in for the May meeting?
We'll have discussed this with Director Rogers about this exact situation and how we could formulate meetings with the full committee in next month, and trying to find out what we needed today if this did come up, what it was would be split, which was discussed back in January as an information item. And that's why I brought it out a while ago before your motion, is that there is concern within committee members that it may need to be separated. So we wanted that discussion today, but with your motion and with a substitute motion, it's now from the ex officio member, which is the EMC Chair Solomon, wanting to look at this maybe to move forward as a total piece into the next meeting, but finding those questions that need to be resolved and give those questions to the department to bring forth answers, if it's from the letter, or if it's from legal, to go over these in next month and do it in a time manner with a waiver, of course, to come with that and to come back in and put it back on course in May. So it's, if you want to certainly withdraw your second or your substitute motion, and you want to go into that direction, I think it is sort of, that's what we're thinking.
Y'all have to vote on it. I'm
Oh,
just
yeah,
telling
I
you,
know
it's
that.
harder to resolve. It's easier if it's all one package and there's common questions to both. I could say there's common questions on the fiscal note, on the training overview, if you have them on 1.4 doxing too, because other things are tightening too. I don't know. Your committee's got to look at the fiscal note and get it right too.
That's right.
For both. So we just had a debate about a fiscal note before, and we got split on a very fine point, and this one doesn't even look like a fiscal note to me, but that's y'all's decision. There seems like there needs to be more clarification.
Okay, Commissioner Ellis.
A question, I guess, for staff. What would be the timeline to amend the fiscal note to look at some of these issues raised by the three municipalities?
Well, I know the fiscal note's being worked on and the draft is being prepared to go to OSBM for discussion and approval within about a week or so. So I don't know if, yeah.
Yeah, here, if I may, Chair, I'm Paul Wojcicki. I supervise the Classification Standards Group in Division of Water Resources. Just to outline the administrative process, what you have today is a fiscal screening analysis, high-level overview of the topics and issues we're trying to cover in the fiscal note. That fiscal note is currently under draft. We intend to get that over to OSBM. OSBM requires a minimum of a 30-day review to certify and approve that fiscal note. And so just want to lay that out as far as the administrative process timeline. And so we're in right now in the draft stages of the fiscal note that would cover the entire Toronto review, inclusive of 1.4 doxing.
What's kind of schedule then do we need in April to make the 30-day? Director Rogers.
It will back it up from the May meeting if that's the timeline. We won't do that, so we'd have to have it over at a minimum. I think the May meeting is the 9th or 10th.
Excuse me, the 9th.
Yeah, the committee's the 9th, so it would have to be April 9th or so to have resolved in what we're submitting.
Will all the committee members be here? If we schedule that then the first, just as discussion, I know we have motions on the floor, to discuss a timeline, would that help?
On April 9th?
First week in April, the second full week in April. We have others.
Chair, in fact, I'm not a member of this committee, but just, I'm not sure you ought to be that governed by the 30-day rule, because we could always do a waiver of the 30-day rule.
We're talking about the fiscal note, not necessarily the action by the
I'm sorry.
commission.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
Thank you. Just trying to get, again, a time period where we can discuss it. If we have enough today, we can move on a vote. But if we don't have, then it's up to the committee, of course, what you would like to do.
Chair. Yeah, I'll tell
Commissioner
you,
Baumgartner?
yes, sir. My hangup is what we've received as a fiscal analysis or fiscal note, whatever you may call it. I mean, it's, what we've got now is less than what we had before. I would like to see that vetted out more thoroughly. Looking at past history of the triennial review process for this one particular item, it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of discussion on anything other than 1,4-dioxane. But it seems to me, and I'm not resolved in my head, that the issues brought up on 1,4-dioxane have been resolved yet. So as far as where I sit on any motion, if it's all or nothing, then fine, it's all or nothing. I think we probably need to go ahead and see where these two motions go with the committee. That's at your pleasure, Mr. Chair. But beyond that, I mean, I've got questions on 1,4-dioxane, and whether it's all or nothing or divided, I don't think I can go forward with 1,4-dioxane in that piece.
Okay, thank you. There's a motion. You going to stick with your motion on your,
Yep.
okay?
Point of order.
I'm going to go there. Before I did that, I was going to ask legal where we are.
First, you need a vote on whether to have the substitute motion, and then you vote on the substitute motion.
Okay. We have a substitute motion on the floor that we separate the two for more information to make that determination. And the substitute motion is on the floor and been seconded. We've had discussion. All those in favor of the substitute motion, raise your hand.
Point of order, point of order. You
Point of
got to
order, had
you got to
discussion?
vote to hear a substitute
To
motion.
hear it, right.
That motion was actually out of order. It's got to be a motion to hear a substitute.
Thank you. Is there a motion then that's been seconded? Do we have any discussion on hearing and discussing the substitute motion?
Any substitute motion, that's
Any, right. Then those in favor of the substitute motion say aye.
No, it's not in favor of the substitute motion.
Of hearing the substitute motion.
Thank you.
Of hearing the substitute motion. All those say aye, that you're in favor of hearing the substitute motion. Aye. Let's raise our hands. All those in favor show sign of raising your hands. 1, 2,
To hear the substitute
To
motion. That
hear.
is the motion on the floor. 1, 2, 3, 4,
5.
5.
I'm sorry, I'll change my vote. I misunderstood. I'll vote no.
To hear the substitute motion.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So
It's
four.
to consider a
get-
substitute motion is what we're asking, right?
Right, to hear the substitute motion.
Not on this vote is not on the substance of the
Right.
motion.
Right.
It's whether to permit the substitute motion vote.
Right.
No,
Okay.
I vote no.
All
So,
right, let's get a show of hands, please.
yes.
Those in favor, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3.
And Mr. Tweedy, were you
I'm going to change it. This is voting to hear the motion.
to hear? Yes. In terms, it's a process question, not the substance of the question. So the vote is 3, and therefore with the full committee of 7 present, the motion does not carry.
Okay, that does not carry, so we'll go over to the motion that Commissioner Deerhake made. And let's just make sure we've got that motion. It's the action item request is on the screen. There's no difference there. You're keeping the 1.4-dioxane together,
Yes, sir.
okay? And that's been seconded by Commissioner Twitty. Any discussion?
Ex officio conversation, guys. You're going, if you go, and I'm not opposed to this going at the right time, but you don't have the fiscal note worked out. You don't have the narrative. You haven't even heard the narrative standards report, and you may decide you want to do something different with 208. You're going to get locked into moving this forward without even hearing a report if you go forward, and you don't have the fiscal note. It's concerning from a process standpoint. Did the committee approve something without a fiscal note?
Yes, yes. And okay, it's been seconded. Now it's up for discussion.
Yeah, your discussion.
So this is to go to public comment. So if we go to public comment, we lose the. continue these discussions that you're concerned with?
My concern as chairman of the EMC is I want the committees to get the rule and the fiscal note, which the whole EMC has to approve at the same time to go to public, to get it, if it's not 100% right, it needs to be 90 or 95% right. That's our policy in the past. We can take one that's not perfect, but this one's far from not perfect. So I'm just got a concern that we bog down in the EMC for several meetings on some of these topics when it really needs to be heard in a committee or special meetings of a committee that we've already kind of anticipated might happen. Because there's 3 reports that have to come in and they don't come in till May or June. And they may impact how you look at either one of these things. Or both. I'm just saying. I'm ex officio, that's
right.
I wanted to end up in the right place, but I think we got to follow a process.
Gotcha. Any other comments? Commissioner Deerhay.
I would ask maybe the staff to confirm this, but the preliminary fiscal analysis, again, I think what this is all centering on is the impact of 1,4-dioxane, but if staff could confirm what the preliminary analysis shows, is it still a 0 increase in fiscal impact?
Yep. Paul Wojcicki again here. So with regard to the preliminary fiscal screening analysis, the intention of this was to set the framework for what we will be reviewing and analyzing in the fiscal note itself. And so this is a framework of what we want to include. We tried to be as detailed as possible in the data we could by looking at, the impact of how many MPS permits have derived criteria limits, how many have 1,4-dioxane limits, how many have monitoring. We will base a cost analysis on that data. That cost analysis, that fiscal data, will then go to OSBN for review and certification, which will require a 30-day process. Out of that product will be a final fiscal analysis. Our intention is to bring that forward to the full EMC with the rulemaking action when that time comes or whenever the committee decides that's appropriate. I will also point out that the timeline that we are on now allows for review of the comment letters from municipal dischargers on the topic, as well as any conclusions from the 1,4-dioxane legislative required study. And so our intention is to make sure that we cover all our bases when we produce a final fiscal note for the EMC to review and consider in their decision-making.
We're working on a change from the 0.35 to 0.33. The fiscal impact of going from 0.35 to 0.33, correct? And from 80 to 40. That's what the fiscal impact analysis will use. They'll use 0.35 as baseline and 80 as a baseline. Is that right? From the 22 standard.
No, so to clarify, the baseline, which is subject to OSBN review and approval per their rules and statute, is that, the 1,4-dioxane compound is being regulated through the translation of our narrative standard presently and will continue. And so that's what we're building as the baseline in the fiscal analysis. So it's not necessarily the change from the 0.33 to 0.35. It's the change from regulating today and monitoring and permit limits we have today to codifying that to a numeric value and what is the delta between the two.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is there any other? Commissioner Ellison had a question.
So OSBM's doing this, right? They're doing the fiscal analysis.
No, the division produces the fiscal analysis. OSBM reviews that and certifies it as according to statute and procedures to make sure.
Have you received a copy of the letter that we got from Reedsville, Greensboro, and Asheboro?
I have, yes.
Okay. And will you wait for the work of the collaborative and the cost analysis that they're doing before you finish your fiscal note?
Yeah, we're on similar timelines with that, but we intend to, translate any conclusions and make sure that there's consistency as much as possible between the two. Yes.
And when is their document due, the report? Is it end of June?
I believe it's May. I believe it's May 1, if I'm
May 1.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Any other discussion? Commissioner Deering.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Did staff choose to come today with a preliminary fiscal analysis for any reason dealing with federal reporting deadlines or triennial review deadlines? Why did they come today with just and chose to come today with a preliminary?
So the general, again, going back to the requirement that we review the standards and go out to public hearing every 3 years. The 3-year deadline is coming up. The last time we did a public hearing for surface water standards was July 20th, 2021. So that puts us at middle of July, basically, to be able to go out to public hearing to meet that Clean Water Act requirement.
And if we don't meet it?
If we don't meet it, that's a discussion with EPA.
But we would be, I wouldn't say in violation, but we would be non-compliant with the EPA schedules, what I'm hearing. And so that's what brought you to us today.
Yes.
Instead of May.
Any other comments, questions? All right, we'll call for a vote then. Understand the motion has been seconded. All those.
Can you repeat the motion is what's on the screen, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Correct. The motion before the committee is the staff recommended motion that was motioned by Commissioner Deerhake and seconded by Commissioner Tweedy.
No other discussion? Let's call for a vote then. All those in favor, raise your hand. That's 2. Not in favor. Not in favor of the motion, raise your hand. 4. And I'll vote 5. All right, motion does not carry. Now, let's resolve this, try to, and if it take, I don't know, I really don't know how to move forward with a waiver. It's only my second meeting, so you'll have to help me with a waiver. If we need one, to have a committee meeting in April to further discuss and to bring more material to the committee in order to resolve whatever that is. But you certainly heard from ex officio Chairman Solomon today and the others. So I'll turn it, I guess, my questioning to Director Rogers to give me some direction as far as dates and staff and how we can approach this.
I think we'll definitely be prepared and get supporting documents related to the fiscal note, the RIA, moving forward. Again, in order, if we want to move this on and try to get it done and get it before the May commission, we'll have to move it expeditiously. Meeting will have to be in the first part of April. I don't know how that works with schedules. That will be a challenge, I imagine, but that's.
At the first week?
Yes.
It starts on a Monday, right? First?
Yes, sir.
So it's the first week or the second week? It's before the 9th, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Let's, how does the committee feel about setting a date the first week in April to have a committee meeting? It's the pleasure of the committee and to resolve this.
Question.
Commissioner Yarborough.
Would this have an opportunity for a remote?
Yes,
Yes,
we
sir.
could do that.
Now, let's approach the waiver on the legal side. We're not going to need a waiver, correct?
You are speaking about the waiver to the EMC's internal rules. If it is if it is within 30 days of a EMC regular meeting, you do need to request that the EMC do a waiver of its internal rules. The EMC, and frankly, that will have to occur on an earlier action item anyway for tomorrow. And so I don't anticipate, based on what you all have done in the past, that being an issue. So it would have to be a vote by 2/3 of the members present and voting to waive the internal rules,
Yeah.
two-thirds of the commission for the May meeting will have to approve the waiver.
Okay.
Commissioner Solomon.
Timeline, I would love to move this at the May EMC meeting, right? There are 4 pieces of information that we need, though, if we were to do that. We need some more information on the fiscal note. We've got the collaboratory study on costs and treatment effectiveness, which is due May 1. So maybe we can have a draft in April, or certainly by the May meeting, we should have that or a draft. We should have the narrative standard report on 208 ordered by the General Assembly for the EMC to do by April, or certainly by May. And we should have the health report specific to one Fort Oxon the department has to do. Certainly a draft, it's due May 1, but we should have a draft in the April timeframe. I'm not opposed, and I think Mayor and I always joke about this on the waiver. The waiver looks worse than it is. I mean, ideally, I'd like the committee to finish their business in April so that we have a clean shot. But if we need May or the information's not ready from the department, it may be that the EMC has to take this up, has to do a waiver for May, or even wait till July. But my goal is to get this out in May. So, but it is contingent on this information coming together so this committee can digest it and put it out there.
It's my understanding that information, all that information will not be ready in April.
May not be. I'm hoping a draft will be ready. But again, we may have to set a meeting in April. And if we have to postpone it, we'll postpone it to the May meeting. If we can't move it, we may have to put the whole thing off to July. But that would be my goal. We've got to have our information. We look silly, guys, if we take this to public hearing and we find something in the reports that contradicts what we send out to public comment.
Right.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Baumgartner.
I'm more amenable to waiting till our standard May water quality meeting. It was like May 8th, is it?
Yes, sir.
Correct. Wrong. I'm more amenable to that, considering these timelines. Sounds like most of the reports are due like the first part of May, right, Chair Solomon?
Ours, the narrative standard is due June 1, and the 2 from the department and the collaboratory due May 1.
I'd rather do that and then vote on the, foregoing the 30-day requirement.
All right.
And move forward to that. If we need an April meeting to discuss and hash things out, that's fine, but I think officially moving this forward, that's my opinion.
Well, thinking about the April meeting, if we had enough to go into the April, but it seems like we just don't have enough. And so May gives some time to put it all together.
Yeah. Yeah, it related to the triennial review.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Could we at least get any documents well enough ahead of the May meeting, please, so that we've had ample time to read it and review it, so we can come prepared?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Receiving a letter, which I received yesterday from the 3 cities,
Yes.
was too late. And you see how it's changed things today.
Yes. It was written March the 8th, and I think it was submitted yesterday. I got it yesterday as well. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, just one note. I think there's concern that there may be a need to vote to defer the action item because it's an action item.
Right. All right. We voted down the action item, but if you want to make it an action item in May, it's certainly all right with me. I do get with Director Rogers, and we do go over all of these items that we have to do, so.
I think the reason for the deferral was just to keep it alive as something that we'll consider in the future, is the purpose of that.
All right. The Police Committee, it's up to you. What do you want to do?
Mr. Chair, I move that we defer this approval to the May Water Quality Committee meeting.
All right. There's a motion on the floor that we defer it till May as an action item. Second? Is there a second to that motion?
I don't see why we did it, but that's okay.
Defer it to May as an action item.
It was disapproved when you did it. We obviously gonna bring it back up, and that can be back in action item. To defer it means that we didn't do anything. I don't understand the rules on that.
It gives us a schedule.
I
so that-
understand that. That's something else besides deferring, something that we voted against. It failed. I'm just going for, I'm not looking for that.
I think you're right. I mean, I don't think we can vote on the same motion
You've already
twice.
failed. It's a, you were doing.
All right.
Well, I withdraw it. Anyway, however procedure we need to do to bring it
Put
to
it
the
on
board.
the, we
Yeah.
make a motion to put it on the.
On the May committee meeting, yeah.
Okay.
Forget the referral. I
All
was
right.
trying to get this thing moving along.
I know we all are. We all are.
Topic on the May agenda.
Right.
Sorry about that.
So,
Right.
no?
I'll second that. Reword it.
Yeah, however to get this moving.
Okay, let's reword it then.
I agree.
Thank you,
with that.
Bill.
Let's reword it. Your motion, you'll put a motion on the floor. What is it?
I'll make a motion to move this action item to the May Water Quality Committee meeting.
I'll second.
Okay. Seconded by Commissioner Yarborough. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Thank you. All right, let's take a real quick break and come back for information items. Thank you. 10 minutes. Come back at 3.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're moving on to information items. As Chair Keene said, we're going to make a few adjustments on a couple of the presentations. We are going to move forward with the update on the narrative study. Obviously, this is a request by the legislature for the EMC Commission to provide a study of the narrative standard. Staff has done some research along the lines and specific items addressed in the provision, and Karen's going to provide a brief update on that. And we'll continue to work with members of this committee as well as we move forward to finalize that study and get it to the legislature by June 1.
Welcome back, Karen.
Thank you. Let's see how quickly I can run through this. So as was mentioned, there was a session law passed in 2023 directing the EMC to review 0208, which is our narrative standard for toxics and temperature. There were a number of provisions spelled out in the session law, things to include in the study, and in the interest of time, I'm just gonna go through. The report is due June 1st of 2024. So there is a draft report outline, and I'm going to just kind of give an update on where staff are at on putting together some of the draft information. There's a good bit of background information about the Clean Water Act and a history of North Carolina's toxic substances. And then there are some findings based on, again, the things outlined in the study to look at. So Chris went through this a little bit, so you'll hear some duplication from things that you've heard previously. But the purpose of the Clean Water Act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Standards include designated best uses, water quality criteria, which include both numeric and narrative criteria, and an anti-degradation policy. You'll often hear criteria and standards used intermixed. So if you hear criteria or standards, they're effectively the same. So under Section 303 of the Clean Water Act, states and authorized tribes are responsible for adopting water quality standards necessary to protect designated uses. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to refer to states, but it includes states as well as authorized tribes. Also, as Chris mentioned, the Clean Water Act as well as EPA regulations require that the states conduct a review of its standards at least once every 3 years, and that's referred to as the triennial review. If EPA determines that the state standard is consistent with the Clean Water Act and the federal regulations, then the standard is approved. If the state standard is not consistent with the Clean Water Act or the federal regulations, then EPA can disapprove the standard. When EPA disapproves the standard, the state can take appropriate actions to correct the standard and resubmit it to EPA. EPA may also promulgate a new water quality standard for the state. So EPA, under the authority given to them in Section 304 of the Clean Water Act, assists states by providing national recommended water quality criteria that are protective for human health and the environment. The national criteria are developed using the latest scientific knowledge and do not reflect considerations of economic impacts or technology feasibility. As the scientific body of knowledge evolves and new toxicity data becomes available, EPA revisits national recommended water quality criteria. All of these changes are peer reviewed and receive public comment before being published. So states can adopt the national recommended water criteria, or they can adopt other criteria based on scientifically defensible methods. This allows states to address pollutants of concern within their state that may not be a concern throughout all 50 states. Per the federal regulations, state criteria must be based on scientific rationale, must contain parameters to protect designated uses, and must protect the most sensitive use. No authority is given in the federal regulations to consider economic impacts or technological feasibility when establishing criteria. Though, as has been discussed, those can be considered on a site-specific basis in SOCs, variances, compliance schedules, and other implementation measures. So getting started at standards, getting into the toxics. In the 1972 amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, Congress stated it is the national policy that the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts be prohibited. In 1987, an amendment was added to the Clean Water Act, which required states to adopt criteria for certain toxic pollutants. When this came out, EPA provided guidance to the states for how to comply with this new effort in a scientifically and technically sound way. They provided 3 options. So option 1 is for the state to adopt numeric criteria for all Section 307 toxic pollutants, regardless of whether they're in the state. Option 2 is to look at Section 307 toxic pollutants and adopt those that are an issue in the particular state. Option 3 is to adopt a procedure to be applied to a narrative water quality standard provision that prohibits toxicity in receiving waters. And this procedure would be used by the state in calculating derived numeric criteria. EPA recommended that if states were looking at option 3, that they do that in combination with option 1 or option 2. In response to the 1987 amendments, the EMC followed the EPA guidance and proposed adopting options 2 and 3 in the 1989 triennial review. They formed a study committee to look at a number of things. And the committee made a couple notations from EPA Region 4, which is the region that North Carolina is in. And EPA Region 4 recommended that states adopt a risk level of 1 × 10⁻⁶, which is 1 in a million. They stated that this represents a negligible risk, and a negligible risk is required by law. EPA guidance also deemed consideration of economic impact in establishing standards unacceptable. The committee concluded that the proposed standards were not more stringent than pristine streams within the state, and that the proposed standards were generally consistent with other Region 4 states, including the risk level of 10⁻⁶. The committee did recommend that North Carolina use mean annual flow in determining effluent limits for carcinogens because the standard is based upon lifetime exposure. And this criteria at the time in 1989 was the least stringent of Region 4 states when the committee had information. So after thorough investigation and public input, the EMC adopted the individual numeric criteria for certain pollutants, option 2, and the narrative standard with procedures used to calculate a derived criteria, option 3. On February 7th, 1991, EPA fully approved the numeric criteria and narrative criteria with the associated translator for toxic pollutants that was adopted by North Carolina as being consistent with options 2 and 3 of the EPA guidance.
Quick question for you, Karen.
Yes, sir.
And this came up already. How do we trigger going into the narrative standard? Who triggers that? How does that happen per the rules and the statutes of the state?
So the request comes from MPDS. Typically, they do a reasonable potential analysis, or I'm not sure I have those words right, but they look at what is reasonable, a reasonable potential to be a pollutant, and then that's sort of, I believe, what triggers.
So it's
I'm not doing a good job explaining it.
It's not a request from unlike groundwater standards, where if that's a request to have an interim standard over there, from somebody with emergency or cleanup to the department for an IMAC. These are pretty much generated inside the department. The need for a narrative standard to activate any narrative, like 2,4-D, let's pick on something that's banned out there or part of it.
So really what we use narrative standards for, a new company or someone was going to do a new product in the state and it has something unusual in a pollutant that we never regulated before, needed to regulate before. And so the MPS permitting rating staff would go down to standard staff and say, here's a new pollutant. We don't have anything on the books for it. What level am I concerned with?
So the industry doesn't request it, but y'all look at it as a staff.
But what we've gotten it in as an application or a new company coming to the state. And at that point, we'll go to the standards group and say, we need help on what's a safe level. And they might say they have information on it, or they might not be able to give us information on it.
So for the committee, and I'm not sure I know this either, but we have this debate on the groundwater standards for the IMAX. If you're only going to do it for one entity, shouldn't they just be doing a variance or some kind of special order of consent versus one company asks you to do something and you do it, activate it statewide, create a standard statewide?
So what we're asking standards to do is develop a number so we can tell the permittee what's safe. And sometimes they can meet that number, no problem. Sometimes they might not need to take action. And it's just for that facility. And that is kind of the crossroads we see ourselves out when it's usually been for one parameter and just a couple facilities.
Right.
When it comes to the crossroad like 1,4-dioxane and it affects many more, then it's really time to move it to a numeric standard.
Right.
Okay.
That's good. Thank you.
So I'm going back, Julie, to something you said earlier, and we had that discussion on 1,4-dioxane. So and I'm just trying to get narrative numeric in my head, so I'm not making any, thing one way or the other. If we set a numeric standard for 1,4-dioxane, let's just say, as a random chemical we're talking about, that is lower than the detection limit, and you guys are working with permittees to set a permittee level for them to meet, aren't you in essence setting a narrative standard for that permittee when there's a numeric standard established? I'm just getting that confused in my head. There's a numeric standard, but you're setting a permit limit, but isn't it the same thing?
We use the narrative standards to develop a permit limit. So there's a set procedure we have to follow to come up with a permit limit. We don't usually take the 0.33 and give it to someone in their permit. They do get credit for dilution. There is a process. There could be mixing zones. There is a process that permittees can follow, and we develop the number then that's what we call an allowable discharge level. Okay, and that's their permit limit, and that's what we put in the permit. Now, if they cannot meet it with technology, or they don't have the current treatment to do it, that's when we sit down and do a compliance schedule or look at other ways that they might have to address it in the situation. Does that make sense to you?
It seems like the same thing. I mean, a narrative standard is a delegate, correct me if I'm wrong, a narrative standard is a delegated authority by the MC for the department to use best case scenario, best information, to develop a standard in lieu of having a numeric threshold, right?
It's just a different type of standard to us.
It's the same thing with a permittee.
Yes, it doesn't matter whether it's numeric or narrative. We follow the same process in permitting.
But the permit limit may be different for different industry.
Right.
For the same product if they discharge into a different receiving. Okay. So that's the limit.
Right. Someone who discharges to where it's just 1 CFS versus 100 CFS is going to have a different number.
Gotcha.
Okay, should I keep going?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Quickly, yes.
Quickly, okay. Okay, so looking at the findings, again, so one of the questions was, is it scientifically sound? The EMC adopted options 2 and 3 based on EPA guidance. And EPA guidance, again, it states that the criteria be based on scientific rationale. So EPA review and approval of the translator deemed that they were acceptable scientific quality. In the interest of time, I won't go through this, but in 1991, EPA set out additional criteria for states using option 3, different things to be met. North Carolina met all of these in 1989. So these were required by EPA for demonstrating it was scientifically sound, and we met that requirement.
Are the translations in rule, the equations in rule, federal rule, or are they just in federal guidance?
So the federal guidance is that states can develop a narrative criteria with a translator mechanism, but the translator mechanism is not in federal regulation. So another requirement of the study was to look at whether it was protective of the environment and human health. When it comes to the environment, we generally look at aquatic life. We look at both chronic and acute standards. Again, looking at 0208, we use human health criteria to protect human health from exposure routes, including both fish consumption and shellfish consumption, as well as water consumption. You know, the calculation is scientifically sound, but to be protective for human health, we recommend updating the health factors for body weight, fish consumption rate, and water consumption rate based on the 2015 updates from EPA. Chris went into that, so I won't belabor that point. So the next question is about whether the standards are technologically achievable and without undue economic burdens. So we've said a number of times that the federal regulations don't allow consideration of these when setting standards, and that's really handled on the implementation side. In 1989, in addition to the technical advisory committee that the EMC put together, they also reached out to the Attorney's General Office to ask for guidance about how to work together with the APA and the general statute regulations. And so they talked about, this is the guidance from the AG's office, stated that water quality standards must be set based on the scientific measurement of their necessity. However, the social and economic costs is useful to the EMC and should not be kept from the record. So these costs should not be used to affect the adoption of the standard that are otherwise required by the public health and welfare. The AG's letter went on to reiterate that the Clean Water Act requirements, if we set standards that are contrary to them, they're subject to disapproval and promulgation by EPA, and reminded the EMC that there are a number of implementation measures such as variances, compliance schedules, where individual costs present a problem. In March 2024, this month, EPA Region 4 staff confirmed this interpretation of the Clean Water Act is still accurate, and added that there is an additional tool that wasn't listed there, which is a use attainability analysis, which is a scientific assessment outlined in the Clean Water Act. So just to kind of bring this home, there's no authority provided in federal regulations to incorporate technological achievability or economic burden when calculating water quality criteria. There is authority provided on the implementation side, looking at effluent limits, so taking a water quality standard, which is in place in the river, and looking at how that impacts a permit limit, which is different from a water quality standard. There's things like variances, compliance schedules, and also the flow. I mentioned this before, but just to reiterate, so in North Carolina, we use the 7Q10 for all standards except carcinogens. For carcinogens, we use a less stringent flow when calculating effluent limits, and that's the mean annual flow for carcinogens. And this is to reflect that it's based on a lifetime exposure. All right, definitely not going to read this.
Yeah, and we might, the remainder of the slides are dealing with how other states have implemented the narrative standard and how they've done that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Karen? And I think we can probably review that when we come back to the committee at the next time, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
And all that's going to be in the draft report anyway, so.
Yes. Oh, but that's the most fun part. All right, well, with that,
You
I'm
can do a
guessing.
general comment to those, right? That,
Oh, okay.
That's what you found exciting about this study and what you've done so far.
Yes, it was quite fascinating to research all 50 states. We are not the most difficult to understand. That gives you any level of comfort. But there is a summary that'll be in the draft report that goes through just kind of in general what we found from other states based on the information available in the standards. And so there certainly is some variability, but North Carolina is not really inconsistent with a number of other states. So thank you for your time, and I will be happy to answer questions offline or.
Karen, thank you so much for putting that together.
Sure. Thank you.
We have some adjustments too because of those who are here in the audience.
Absolutely. And Paul, if you'll come up real quickly, just a brief update on the South Yakin intake that we have looked at last time and talked. And Paul is just going to give you all a little briefing recommendation that staff has developed and then provide just the timeline that we're moving forward on this. And it should just take just a minute.
Good afternoon, committee members. Again, here, Paul Wojcicki. I supervise the Classification and Standards Group at the Division of Water Resources. And Elizabeth Liebig, who you've heard from before on this topic, couldn't be here today. So I'm stepping in just to provide a very brief update at the committee's request. And so if you recall, during last November and January's committee meetings, we provided updates on the Salisbury Rowan Utilities proposal or upcoming proposal to reclassify some of the Yadkin and South Yadkin and their associated tributaries for water supply classification. In that discussion, there were some questions about the designated protected land use watershed area. And so I'll just be presenting very quickly what the position and what DWR's recommendation will be when this comes forward in front of the committee for action. And so very briefly, DWR will be recommending that the EMC treat this relocated intake as pre-existing and support Salisbury Rowan Utilities proposal or their proposed watershed boundary for the critical and protected areas, extending a different distance from the intake and actualizing the part of the rule in 15A NCAC 02B, 02, 20 and 48 Part C. That's the part that allows the different distance. This will be recommended because the current intake was constructed prior to the completion of the dam and the presence of the reservoir. And this is a relocation of that current intake. In addition, this position is supported by the core mix analysis that the utility conducted in 2006 that stated that water was modeled at a unidirectional flow of 735 cubic feet per second at that location. In addition, the rule does provide the commission the authority to approve a different distance from that intake. Currently, the division, our classifications and standards team is working with our water sciences team and has developed a use and value demonstration, a study of the water quality criteria in the area. And for that study, we have used Salisbury Rowan Utilities' proposed watershed boundaries to define the bounds of that study area. That study has completed its data collection phase. It's under their data analysis phase and report writing phase, and we will have that report for the action item. In addition, we were requested to provide an update or a confirmation of the rulemaking timeline. And so to that end, the rulemaking timeline is as proposed on the slide you see in front of you. The next, I just spoke about the next step about the use and value study report. We will also have to prepare the rulemaking package, which includes drafting the rules and writing the regulatory impact analysis. And then we anticipate coming back to the committee with an action item in May, and then to, request action to proceed to the EMC and then to public notice. Salisbury Road Utilities has confirmed and provided concurrence with this timeline, and the documentation of that is provided in your attached materials. And that is all I have for the update. Happy to answer any questions at the chair's discretion.
Any questions? Oh, thank you, Commissioner Derrick.
So this is a change, a dramatic change from what was presented to us last time. They're still seeking a reclassification. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
But the staff is recommending the reclassification be granted on the grounds that they were a pre-existing pipe into the water, right?
Yes, so to help clarify, so the reclassification, the water has not changed. The area in which the watershed boundaries for the critical and protected area that protect that water supply intake was the issue at question, whether that water supply boundary should be around the reservoir or upstream along the riverine portion.
Is there any precedent to taking this rationale? Has this been used before for any other water utility? And will this, hopefully we'll know when we get your data back, but will this still be the equivalent of protecting and defining the critical area protecting the water quality and defining the critical area that Salisbury originally sought?
So to the first part of the question about precedent, so there is one precedent, my understanding, as we look back in our files, of a water supply intake that was in a river intake and a reservoir was constructed. In that instance, the owner of the utility came to the division and requested that the water supply boundary be changed pursuant to the reservoir. That's the only instance we have that is any type of precedence or previous example.
Okay. And do you anticipate that the data that come in from your study will also demonstrate that the proposed critical area is adequate?
So this study is aimed at measuring the water quality criteria for those waters and their suitability as far as water supply and drinking water supply. The study is not a study of hydrologic flow as to, the hydrodynamics of the area.
Yeah, but we're talking about defining the critical area. That's what you mean when you say the hydrodynamic flow.
Yeah, so hopefully this can clarify. So the critical area and protected area that was proposed by Salisbury Road Utilities is the same area that we have studied to see if the water quality criteria meets the water supply classification.
So then if your findings are satisfactory to you all, then their original request is going to be pretty much met. And you'll be agreeing with their original request that what they're proposing as critical area is adequate. And if that's the case, why go with a very rare, if ever preceded rationale with a pre-existing? Because that doesn't really fit within the description of the whole critical watershed protection program. You're stepping out of the norm, and it may send a message that cannot be used in future cases. If somebody had said, well, Salisbury asked for it, I'm going to go ask for the same thing. Tell us about that.
Well, I think your point is well taken, Commissioner Deerhake, and we'll look at that as we continue to work with Salisbury and move this forward.
But we're asking, we're being asked to take a vote in May.
And we will make
And-
sure we're clear on our proposal and our recommendation in May as well.
But Salisbury says they're also on a very tight schedule.
I understand.
And
Yep.
so if there's enough uncertainty about taking the tact of using a rationale that's basically one precedent, only one, versus just going ahead and staying consistent with the rule and saying, this altered critical area is adequate, why pursue this new approach?
I think that's a very good point.
So are we going to have adequate time in Water Quality Committee, or will it will be Water Quality Committee, right? We'll have adequate time in Water Quality Committee to discuss this thoroughly?
We will.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
It'll be right now it's planned to be an action item.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ellison?
Just bring the maps next time, because the maps go a long way to understanding what they're looking to do.
I fully understand that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Julie Gribb is going to be presenting real briefly just an update on our efforts on PFAS and our efforts in communicating with the public in general and interested parties, outreach that we've done as well. She'll spend a few minutes on that. And just to be aware, we understand there's interest on this topic, and Julie will make herself available after the meeting if folks have any questions.
And with that, PFAS is extremely long run, forever, ever. So we could be here forever, but we have a group from Tarpam that wanted to hear.
We're going to address that right after this presentation.
And after this, and then I would like to conclude at 10 till and give Commissioner Reardon time to
Absolutely.
get ready for his next committee.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, I'll go fast. It's more to give you an update on PFAS development of the standards and more so what we've done with the stakeholders meetings. I'm not going to go over this because we know PFAS is an emerging compound and you know that it's pretty ubiquitous and that we see it in a lot of things. It is important that I change this slide. This is one slide different than what you received. I want to be clear that this proposed PFAS is for the 8 PFAS are for the numeric standards. It's to be a numeric standard. This is not a narrative standard. However, the procedure and the calculations were based on the 2B 208 procedures and calculations. Okay. We derived fish consumption and water supply designated use derived criteria using carcinogenic and non-carcinogenic endpoints where applicable. Yeah. We used the reference dose, cancer slope, bioaccumulation. We used the updated exposure factors. Okay. And these are the numbers that we shared with the stakeholders. So we wanted to share them with you as well today. There'll be plenty of discussion in the future when they are actually presented to you. I just want you to see the numbers that we presented to the stakeholders. As you can see, they're low numbers. The main ones of concern would be PFOS and PFOA to our stakeholders. And PFHXS would probably be the main ones that we see also in background. Okay. The reason I have the last column is what, as we told our stakeholders, is that what we would do with PFAS, if we would say if your limit is below the PQL, we will give you the PQL as the permit limit in your permit. This is a change what we've done in the past, where we would give them the low number, and then we would write a footnote that simply said the PQL is X, and anything you submit that's less than X is sufficient. Okay. So PFOA and PFOS would be 4 and 4. Okay. What we really were there to talk about were the implementation of the standards, and with PFAS, this is what we want to be open about, because everybody is concerned how we're going to implement these standards, and we would write it into rule how we're going to implement them so that everybody has an understanding. We're going to do a reasonable approach. Right now, we are spending the first couple years just doing assessment, investigations. Where does the PFAS come from? Our POTWs have come to us and literally had said, we want to know where it's coming from. We do not want to just sample our effluent. We really want to know where it's coming from. And so a lot of them are starting to do SIU, significant industrial user sampling. We need that to happen for about 2 years. Okay, during that time, we'd hopefully adopt PFAS standards. And during that time, EPA would probably likely implement the MCLs. And during that time, we would hope that 1633, a wastewater test for PFAS, would be finalized and published. A lot of wishful thinking, I know, but that's what we expect to happen. After that, we would want 2 years of certified testing using that certified test method 1633. So that right there is about 4 years of testing, and the benefit of our POTWs to really figure out where it's coming from, the industrial users to figure out where it's coming from, and to start implementing best management practices, changing, substituting their product lines, their materials, et cetera. And then around 2028, we would start implementing, we would do the reasonable potential based on the data that the permittees collected, and we would assess whether they needed a permit limit for these 8 PFAS. And we would put these limits in, and of course, with a compliance schedule, working with the permittee on what is reasonable. This just goes over what you just saw on the chart, but I just want to recognize, as we've discussed with our stakeholders, we want to put in reasonable and feasible milestones and permits targeting facilities with higher discharge concentrations first, and making sure all new dischargers meet the limits immediately so they're not adding PFAS to our state waters. And we would also look at effluent limits would be set that would not be set below the detection level. We had a stakeholder meeting on January 29th and 30th. We had representatives from all these different groups. And their main concerns, without a doubt, were cost. They were concerned with background and uncontrollable sources, and how we would apply the effluent limits. In addition, the water treatment plants in particular were very concerned because they would be treating upfront as it came in and treating backwash or reject waters, and they felt like it would just be cost prohibitive for the customers. So we may implement the standards differently on water treatment plants. We are talking with them now about different ways to address it. Of course, again, sources and so on, but what their main objective was that give priority to the PFAS creators, not if it's coming into the plant and it's leaving the plant. Don't regulate, they don't want to be regulated, but look at the PFAS creators. And so what we have left to do is consider how the stakeholders' feedback can be used to revise the implementation plan, to meet, they wanted to meet again, and we thought that was a great idea. And we'll tell them there are ideas, and we'll see if we've addressed all their concerns. We'd also need to hold a stakeholder meeting with environmental organizations, they wanted to say as well. And the physical analysis approach is being updated based on the implementation plan adjustments where applicable. So again, we want to work on revising the implementation plan. We want to define things like what is a higher discharge concentration? What does that mean? We might set like tiers. Again, we want the people who are creating PFAS. For example, a new facility came in, they're a landfill, they have PFAS. Okay. And we want them to meet the numbers from day one and discharge properly. And they are happy to do so and meet the numbers. And that is a win-win for everybody in the state. Okay. And so that's where we stand. Any questions?
Thank you.
Okay.
Finally, Mr. Chair, I'm just going to do a brief update on the proposed revisions to the TARPAM nutrient strategy wastewater discharge requirements. This is something that we wanted to bring to the committee as an action item today. You were kind enough to move it to an information item in our process. Basically, we're translating an MOU that the Tarapamlico Basin Association and others have worked with and staff over the years, and putting it into rule is all we're doing here. We are, as we're working through that process, Tar-Pamlico Basin Association reached out and had some concerns with our draft proposal of the rule. We have been talking with them, had 2 meetings to date with them, and are taking their concerns into consideration. That's why we wanted to move it to an information item so that we can bring it back to the committee hopefully in May. So that we can move forward with it then, but we'll work out those issues and want to have those worked out before we brought it to the committee. Answer any questions. We appreciate Tar-Pamlico Basin Folks Association representatives being here today, and we look forward to continue to work with you.
Does that conclude all information items?
That's all I got.
Yes. Okay. We were all running about 30 minutes behind Joe. Sorry.
Better than last time.
About 30 minutes. So, any closing remarks from any committee members? I don't have any other than just appreciate so much work being done by the department and all the time that you spend doing all you do.
One thing, something's been brought to my attention. Obviously, the city of Greensboro, Reidsville, and Asheboro letter came in. We will get that posted on the EMC website for other folks to have access to it, just to make sure it's available, and we'll do that today. So you can access that if you're interested on the website. Thank you.
Any comments? This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.